Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Roman road builders who walked behind the legions. If you imagine the expansion of the Roman Empire, your mind probably fills with familiar images. Armored soldiers marching in precise formation, eagles carried on tall poles, trumpets echoing through valleys, generals giving speeches about victory and glory. But if you slow down the image just a little, you might notice something quieter following behind the marching army. Not soldiers, workers, hundreds of them. They carry shovels, baskets, wooden measuring rods, iron picks, and bundles of rope. Their clothes are dusty, their sandals thick with mud, and their work begins exactly when the soldiers stop marching. These men are the road builders of Rome, and although history rarely remembers their names, the empire itself could not have existed without them. If you were standing on a hillside somewhere in Gaul around 50 BCE, during the campaigns of Julius Caesar, you would see the pattern clearly. First comes the army, then comes the road, and the road builders walk quietly behind. The Roman obsession with roads. The Romans had a simple belief about power. Power travels. If soldiers, messages, supplies, and officials can move quickly, then an empire can survive. If movement becomes slow or uncertain, control begins to crumble. So Rome invested enormous effort into one very specific technology: roads. By the height of the empire, Rome maintained more than 250,000 miles of roads, with about 50,000 miles paved in stone. These roads connected the empire from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Britain. One of the earliest and most famous examples is the Appian Way, constructed in 312 BCE. The Romans called it Via Appia, and they proudly described it as Regina Viarum, the Queen of Roads. But the Appian Way is just the beginning. Over centuries, Roman engineers and laborers built roads through mountains, marshes, forests, and deserts. They cut hills flat, drained wetlands, and laid stones so precisely that parts of those roads still exist today. Yet when historians describe Roman infrastructure, they often focus on the engineers, not the workers. And that is where our story begins. Who were the road builders? The road builders were not a single group. They came from many different parts of Roman society. Some were soldiers, assigned temporarily to construction duty. Roman legions were trained not only to fight, but also to build forts, bridges, and roads. Others were enslaved laborers, forced to perform the hardest physical tasks. Many were local villagers, recruited or taxed into work crews when the road passed through their region. And some were specialized workers, stone cutters, surveyors, and craftsmen who traveled with the Roman army for years at a time. Imagine waking before sunrise in a temporary Roman camp. The soldiers are still sleeping, but the builders are already awake. The air smells faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, a cook stirs a pot of porridge. Then the work begins. Surveying the line of the road. Before the first shovel touches the soil, Roman surveyors walk the land. They carry an instrument called a groma, a simple but effective tool that helps them measure straight lines and right angles. Roman roads are famous for their straightness. Whenever possible, they cut directly across the landscape instead of winding around obstacles. Hills might be carved down, valleys might be bridged. The surveyors place wooden stakes into the ground, marking the future path of the road. If you followed them, you would see them packing distances carefully, checking angles, adjusting the line slightly to avoid unstable soil or hidden marshes. Behind them, the laborers wait quietly. Once the line is approved, the real work begins. Digging the roadbed. The first step is excavation. Workers dig a long trench along the marked path of the road. This trench might be 3 to 6 feet deep, depending on the terrain. The digging is slow and exhausting. Roman picks are iron, but the handles are wood, and the soil can vary from soft earth to stubborn clay or solid rock. Teams rotate through the work. Some dig. Others carry soil away in baskets. Others widen the trench walls. The trench forms the foundation of the road. Roman builders know something that modern engineers also understand. The strength of a road depends on what lies beneath it. Layer by layer. Once the trench is complete, the builders begin layering materials inside it. The process follows a consistent structure. First comes the stamen, a layer of large stones laid flat to form the base. Above that sits the rudus, a thick mixture of gravel and lime. Then comes the nucleus, a finer mixture of sand and crushed stone that creates a compact, smooth surface. Finally, the road is finished with large polygonal paving stones, fitted tightly together like an enormous puzzle. Each stone must be shaped carefully. Stone cutters sit beside piles of rock, tapping steadily with iron chisels. The rhythm of hammering echoes across the construction site. You might hear tap, tap, tap all day long. It is not dramatic work. It is slow, repetitive, and physically demanding. But over time, something remarkable appears across the landscape. A road that looks almost permanent. The importance of drainage. Roman road builders paid careful attention to something many travelers never notice. Water. If rainwater sits on a road, it weakens the surface and creates mud. Over time, even stone roads can collapse. So Roman roads are slightly crowned, raised in the center, and sloping gently toward the edges. Along the sides, workers dig ditches that carry rainwater away. In marshy regions, builders sometimes construct the entire road on raised embankments, using enormous amounts of soil and stone. This type of work can take months or even years. And during that time, the builders live in temporary camps. Life in the camps. Life for Roman road workers is quiet but demanding. The camps are simple. Rows of tents or wooden huts. Cooking fires. Storage piles of stone and gravel. Every morning, the workers follow the same routine. Wake before dawn. Eat a simple meal of grain or bread. Work until midday. Rest briefly. Work again until sunset. The soldiers nearby may train with weapons, but the builders lift stones and dig trenches. Their bodies become strong in a different way. Their hands grow calloused. Their backs ache constantly. And yet their work moves the empire forward, mile by mile. Why roads changed everything. Once completed, a Roman road becomes a kind of silent engine for the empire. Soldiers can march 25 miles in a single day. Messengers carrying official orders travel even faster. Merchants begin using the road to transport goods between towns. Farmers bring crops to markets. Governors move between provinces. In time, villages appear along the roadside. Roads become arteries of civilization. And yet the men who built them are rarely remembered. No statues stand for them in Rome. No poets write about their labor. But every Roman general understands the truth. Armies win battles. Roads win empires. A road through Gaul. During the campaigns of Julius Caesar in Gaul, roads become essential. The region is full of dense forests, muddy ground, and scattered tribes. Moving an army quickly is difficult. So the Roman solution is simple. Build more roads. After the legions conquer a territory, the builders arrive and begin cutting a new path across the landscape. The road allows Roman troops to return quickly if rebellion begins. It also allows merchants, settlers, and administrators to follow. This is how conquest slowly becomes control, not just with swords, but with stone, the sound of an empire being built. If you stood beside one of these construction sites and listened carefully, you would hear the quiet sounds of empire building. Shovels scraping soil, stones sliding into place, hammers striking chisels, workers calling to each other as they lift heavy blocks. None of it sounds heroic. None of it sounds like the grand moments historians usually record. But these sounds repeat across thousands of miles of land, year after year, generation after generation, until eventually, the Roman road network becomes one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. The workers who disappeared from history. Here is the strange part. We know the names of emperors. We know the names of generals. But the builders, the thousands of workers who spent their lives laying stone across continents, remain mostly invisible. A few inscriptions survive. Occasionally, a carved stone mentions the legion responsible for a section of road. But the individual workers rarely appear. Their labor is everywhere. Their names are nowhere. And yet without them, the Roman Empire might have remained a small Italian state instead of a vast Mediterranean power. A question left on the road. As the sun sets over the construction site, the workers put down their tools. The unfinished road stretches forward into the distance. Tomorrow they will continue. One more mile. Then another. Then another. The empire grows quietly beneath their feet. But something curious begins to happen once the roads are finished. Because roads do not only allow armies to move outward, they also allow ideas, goods, and people to move in every direction. And over time, these same roads that strengthened Rome would also begin to carry forces the empire could not easily control. Which raises a quiet question. Could the very roads that built the Roman Empire also help unravel it? If you return to the Roman road construction site the next morning, you would notice something immediately. The road builders have already started working again. The soldiers may still be organizing their gear or preparing for the next march, but the builders are lifting stones, measuring lines, and packing gravel long before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. Roman roads are not built quickly. They are built carefully. And the workers understand something important. Once a road is finished, it may remain in use for centuries. That means mistakes are not acceptable. Every stone must sit firmly. Every layer must be compacted. Every ditch must carry water away properly. Because if the foundation fails, the entire road will slowly break apart. And so the quiet labor continues. The workers who stayed behind. When a Roman army moves on, not all of the builders leave with it. Some remain behind. A completed Roman road still requires constant maintenance, and that responsibility usually falls on local communities. Village leaders along the road receive orders from Roman administrators. Sections of the road must be repaired regularly. Loose stones must be reset. Drainage ditches must be cleared. Bridges must be inspected. If these duties are ignored, travelers complain and complaints eventually reach Roman officials. This system quietly spreads responsibility across the empire. The road builders who first carved the path may disappear, but their work creates a permanent obligation for the people living nearby. Over time, entire communities become tied to the care of Roman infrastructure. The marching speed of an empire. To understand why these roads mattered so much, imagine traveling before they existed. Without roads, long-distance travel in the ancient world was slow and unpredictable. Wagons became stuck in mud. Rivers forced travelers to detour miles upstream to find safe crossings. Dense forests blocked direct paths between settlements. But a Roman road changed everything. A properly built road allowed a Roman legion to move 25 miles in a single day, sometimes even more under pressure. Messengers carrying official orders could travel faster still, switching horses at relay stations. The empire created a communication system called the cursus publicus, a network of government couriers using the roads to deliver messages across vast distances. Orders from the emperor in Rome could reach distant provinces within days or weeks instead of months. That speed gave the Roman government something extremely valuable: control. The road stations. If you walked along one of these roads long enough, you would eventually reach a road station. These stations were placed roughly every 15 to 20 miles, about the distance a traveler could comfortably walk in a day. Some stations were simple resting points. Others grew into small towns. Travelers could find fresh horses, food, shelter, blacksmiths, wheel repairers. Government messengers had special permission to change horses quickly and continue their journey without delay. Merchants used the stations as trading points. Soldiers stopped there while marching between forts. Over time, these roadside stations became busy places filled with many languages and accents from across the empire. And none of it would exist without the quiet workers who laid the original stones. The shape of Roman roads. Roman roads were designed with a practical shape that modern engineers still recognize. The center of the road is slightly higher than the edges, forming a gentle curve. This design allows rainwater to flow toward the sides. If you look carefully at surviving Roman roads today, you can still see this curved surface. The stones are fitted tightly together, often without mortar, relying on precise shaping and weight to keep them locked in place. Some roads also include raised curbstones, protecting pedestrians from wagon wheels. Others have milestones placed at regular intervals. These milestones mark distances from major cities, and sometimes include the name of the emperor who ordered repairs or improvements. Standing beside one of these stones, you might see a carved inscription honoring a ruler like Augustus. The emperor receives the credit. But again, the builders remain unnamed. Through mountains and rivers. Not every road passes easily across the landscape. Sometimes the builders face enormous natural obstacles. Mountains must be crossed. Rivers must be bridged. Marshes must be drained. In mountainous regions, Roman engineers sometimes cut narrow paths directly into cliffs. Workers chip away at stone walls for weeks or months. In other places, they build switchbacks, allowing wagons to climb steep slopes gradually. When a river blocks the path, the Romans build bridges. Some are wooden structures, replaced regularly. Others are massive stone bridges, designed to last for centuries. Many of these bridges still stand today, silent reminders of the builders who shaped them. The human cost of the roads. Building roads at this scale requires enormous amounts of labor. And not all of that labor is voluntary. Many road builders are enslaved people, captured during Roman military campaigns. Others are prisoners forced to work as punishment. Their lives are hard. They lift stones weighing dozens of pounds. They dig trenches under hot sun or cold rain. In dangerous terrain, accidents happen. Heavy rocks slip. Cliffs crumble. Tools break. Roman writers rarely describe these workers in detail, but archaeological evidence tells us that construction sites were places of intense physical strain. For some workers, the road becomes their entire world. Miles of stone stretching endlessly forward. The roads and trade. Once the roads are finished, merchants quickly begin to use them. A wagon loaded with goods can travel much farther on a solid road than on rough dirt paths. Grain from North Africa moves toward Italian ports. Wine from Gaul travels into northern Europe. Olive oil from Spain spreads throughout the empire. Roman roads quietly transform regional economies. Local farmers gain access to distant markets. Craftsmen can sell goods far from their hometowns. Trade routes expand. Cities grow. The empire becomes economically interconnected in ways that were once impossible. And once again, the builders who made this possible fade into the background. The famous phrase. Centuries later, people would repeat a famous phrase. All roads lead to Rome. The idea behind this phrase is simple. Roman roads were carefully measured so that distances were calculated from the center of the empire. At the heart of the road network stood a monument in Rome called the Millenarium Aureum, the golden milestone. It symbolized the idea that every road connected back to the capital. But the phrase also captures something deeper. Roman roads were not random paths. They were part of a carefully planned system. Every new road strengthened the empire's ability to move people, goods, and information. And the workers who built them understood that they were part of something enormous even if they rarely saw the full picture. A soldier's perspective. Imagine a Roman soldier marching north along a freshly completed road. His armor is heavy. His shield rubs against his shoulder. But the road beneath his feet is smooth and reliable. He does not sink into mud. He does not lose his way in dense forest. Every mile marker tells him exactly how far he has traveled. He may never think about the builders who placed each stone, but their work carries him forward. Without them, the army would move slowly and struggle to maintain supply lines. Victories would become harder. Rebellions would spread faster. In quiet ways, the builders shape the outcome of military campaigns they never fight in. When roads outlive empires. Here is one of the most fascinating details about Roman roads. They often outlast the empire itself. When Roman political control begins to weaken centuries later, many of the roads remain intact. Local populations continue using them. Medieval travelers walk the same stone paths. Merchants guide wagons along the same routes. In some places, modern highways follow the exact path of Roman roads built 2,000 years ago. The empire that created them disappears, but the infrastructure remains. And this raises an interesting thought. When we study ancient empires, we usually focus on battles, emperors, and political events. But sometimes the most lasting achievements are the quiet ones. A road, a bridge, a drainage ditch. Small, practical decisions that shape history long after the rulers who ordered them are gone. The endless road. If you walk far enough along a Roman road, you may begin to notice something strange. The road never seems to end. It stretches across plains, hills, forests, and deserts. It connects cities you have never heard of. It leads into territories that were once foreign lands. And somewhere long ago, a group of workers stood at the edge of that land and began digging the first trench. They had no idea that their labor would help create one of the most powerful empires in human history. They simply followed instructions, measured distances, placed stones, and moved forward 1 mile at a time. A quiet question, but there is something else the builders may not have realized. Roads do not belong only to armies and emperors. Once a road exists, anyone can use it. Merchants, travelers, refugees, rebels, ideas, religions. Over time, The Roman road network begins carrying things that Roman leaders never intended. Strange new beliefs, foreign traders, movements of people that cannot easily be controlled, which leads to a quiet historical mystery. Could the same roads that allowed Rome to conquer the world also help spread the ideas that would eventually transform the empire itself? If you walk along certain paths in Europe today, quiet rural lanes, narrow stone tracks, or even the foundation beneath a modern highway, you might unknowingly be walking on something very old. Beneath the surface, sometimes hidden by centuries of repairs and new construction, lies the careful work of Roman road builders. The stones were placed nearly 2,000 years ago, and yet the road still exists. This is perhaps the most remarkable detail about Roman roads. They were not built simply for the moment. They were built with a quiet expectation that they would endure. And in many cases, they did. But the story of the Roman roads is not only about engineering. It is also about how something created to strengthen an empire eventually became part of a world far beyond Roman control. To understand that transformation, you have to imagine the roads after the legions were gone. The highways of the ancient world. By the height of the Roman Empire, the road network stretched across an enormous territory. From the island province of Britain, through the forests of Germany, across the plains of Gaul, and all the way to the deserts of the Middle East, the empire was tied together by stone paths. Some historians estimate that the Roman road network eventually reached over 400,000 kilometers in total length. Of those, tens of thousands of kilometers were paved in carefully fitted stone. Travelers moving along these routes passed milestones marking distances and towns that grew gradually along the roadside. Many of those towns existed for a simple reason. The road passed through them. Where roads meet, people gather. And where people gather, settlements grow. Small roadside stations slowly turned into villages. Villages became towns. Some towns eventually became cities that still exist today. In this way, the quiet work of road builders influenced the shape of European geography itself. The movement of ideas. Earlier, we spoke about the way roads allowed soldiers and merchants to move quickly across the empire. But there was another kind of traveler using these roads. Teachers, preachers, philosophers, ordinary individuals carrying new beliefs. In the 1st century CE, one such traveler moved along Roman roads across the eastern Mediterranean. His name was Paul the Apostle. Paul traveled extensively across Roman provinces, visiting cities connected by the empire's road system and sea routes. Without the Roman transportation network, such journeys would have been far slower and more dangerous. But with the roads, ideas could travel as efficiently as armies. Over time, communities of believers formed in many Roman cities. These communities were small at first, quiet gatherings in private homes, but they slowly spread along the same routes used by merchants and soldiers. Roman roads unintentionally became pathways for cultural change. Trade that never stopped. Even as new ideas moved along the roads, trade continued to expand. A merchant traveling from Spain might carry olive oil eastward. Another from Gaul might transport wine to northern markets. Spices from the eastern provinces passed through cities before reaching the western Mediterranean. Wagons creaked along the stone surfaces day after day. Horses and mules carried cargo across long distances. Travelers stopped at roadside inns where news spread quickly between strangers. These roads were not quiet highways. They were busy corridors of movement. And for centuries, the traffic never seemed to stop. The maintenance problem. But roads, even stone ones, cannot last forever without care. As the centuries passed, the Roman Empire began to face growing problems. Political instability increased. Military conflicts stretched resources. Economic pressures made large infrastructure projects harder to maintain. Roads that once received regular repairs began to deteriorate. Drainage ditches filled with soil. Loose paving stones shifted. Bridges weakened. Local communities still used the roads, but without the centralized organization of the Roman government, repairs happened less frequently. Slowly, the once perfect network began to show its age. Yet many roads remained usable long after imperial authority faded. The end of Roman control. By the 5th century, Roman political power in Western Europe was collapsing. Various groups moved into territories that Rome had once governed. Among them were tribes such as the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, whose leaders included figures like Alaric I. Cities changed hands. Administrative systems disappeared. Roman officials no longer controlled distant provinces. But the roads remained, and the new rulers used them just as the Romans had. Armies marched along them. Merchants traveled their length. Pilgrims followed them toward holy places. The empire that built the roads vanished, but the roads themselves quietly adapted to new eras. Medieval travelers. Centuries later, medieval travelers still depended on many Roman routes. Pilgrims walking towards sacred destinations used ancient roads as guides. Traders pulling carts across Europe preferred the old stone foundations where they still existed. Some Roman bridges continued to stand, providing safe crossings long after the empire that built them had faded into memory. Even medieval maps sometimes followed the same general pathways that Roman engineers had planned. For many travelers, these roads were simply part of the landscape. Few thought about the workers who had built them centuries earlier. Archaeologists rediscover the builders. In modern times, archaeologists have studied the remains of Roman roads in great detail. Excavations reveal the careful layers beneath the surface. The base stones, the compacted gravel, the precisely fitted paving stones. Each layer tells a story about the techniques Roman builders used. Sometimes archaeologists find small details left behind by workers. Fragments of tools, marks from chisels on stone surfaces, occasional inscriptions naming a legion responsible for construction. These discoveries remind us that behind every mile of Roman road were thousands of individual acts of labor. Hands lifting stones, feet walking the same ground again and again. Workers whose names rarely survived. The modern world in Roman roads. Many modern transportation routes follow the same path chosen by Roman surveyors. Engineers today often discover that Roman road builders had already identified the most efficient routes through landscapes. In some places, modern highways are built directly over ancient Roman foundations. In other regions, Roman roads remain visible as long straight lines cutting across fields and hills. If you look at aerial photographs of parts of Europe, you can sometimes trace these lines easily. They appear as subtle ridges in farmland or narrow stone tracks winding through forests. Each one represents a decision made long ago by a surveyor holding a measuring tool and looking across unfamiliar land. The quiet legacy of the workers. When we think about historical achievements, we often imagine dramatic events. Battles, political speeches, royal ceremonies. But the Roman road system reminds us that history is also shaped by quieter forces. The labor of ordinary workers, the repetition of simple tasks, the slow accumulation of small efforts. A man lifting one stone does not feel like he is building an empire. But when thousands of people repeat that same action over years and decades, the result can reshape continents. Roman road builders did not know how far their work would reach. They likely focused only on the next trench, the next pile of stones, the next mile marker. Yet their work connected cities, spread trade, carried ideas, and shaped the movement of people for centuries. A walk into the past. Imagine walking along one of these ancient roads today. The surface may be uneven now. Grass may grow between the stones. Trees might lean over the path, casting long shadows across it. But beneath your feet lies a structure carefully assembled long ago. Layer by layer, stone by stone, each piece placed by someone who woke early, lifted heavy loads, and repeated the same work day after day. These workers never appeared in the speeches of emperors. They were not celebrated in grand monuments. Yet their work quietly carried armies, merchants, travelers, and ideas across an entire world. The final reflection. Empires often appear in history as stories of powerful leaders. But when you look more closely, you begin to notice the quieter figures standing behind those leaders. Farmers growing food, messengers carrying orders, builders laying foundations. The Roman road builders were part of that silent majority. Their labor created one of the most influential infrastructure systems in human history. Even today, long after the empire itself has vanished, parts of their work remain. Stone paths still crossing fields, straight lines through forests, routes that shaped where cities rose and where people traveled. History rarely records the names of these workers, but every surviving mile of Roman road is a reminder that the strength of empires often rests on the quiet effort of people history almost forgets. And once you begin noticing these overlooked workers in the Roman world, another question naturally appears. Because Rome was not the only civilization built on quiet labor. Across medieval Europe, there were individuals who spent their entire lives performing a very different kind of repetitive work, copying words by candlelight, page after page, year after year. Without them, many of the books that shaped modern knowledge might have vanished completely. Who were these patient workers, and how did their silent dedication preserve centuries of human thought? Story 2. The medieval monks who copied the world by candlelight. If you enter a medieval monastery just before sunrise, the world feels unusually quiet. Stone walls hold the cool air of the night. The corridors smell faintly of wax, old parchment, and wood smoke drifting in from the kitchen fires. Somewhere deeper in the building, a bell echoes softly through the halls. A few figures move slowly through the dim light. They wear long robes, their footsteps nearly silent against the worn stone floor. These are monks. Most people imagine monks spending their days praying, meditating, or tending gardens. And indeed they do those things. But in many monasteries across medieval Europe, there was another activity that quietly shaped the future of human knowledge. The copying of books. Long before printing presses existed, every single book had to be copied by hand. If a text was to survive, someone needed to sit down with ink and parchment and reproduce it word by word. That responsibility often fell to monks working in a special room called the scriptorium. The work was slow, careful, and sometimes painfully repetitive. But without it, much of the knowledge of the ancient world might have disappeared forever. The fragile survival of knowledge. After the western provinces of the Roman Empire weakened in the 5th century, Europe entered a period of political instability. Cities shrank. Trade networks declined. Many Roman institutions disappeared. Among the things most vulnerable during this time were books. Books in the ancient world were expensive and fragile. They were not printed on cheap paper, but written on materials like papyrus or parchment. Papyrus made from reeds deteriorated easily in damp climates. Parchment made from animal skin lasted longer, but it required tremendous effort to produce. Without people deliberately copying texts, manuscripts slowly decayed and vanished. In many places across Europe, monasteries became one of the few stable environments where books could survive. And inside those monasteries, monks quietly became the guardians of written knowledge. The birth of the scriptorium. The word scriptorium simply means a place for writing. In some monasteries, it was a large shared room with tall windows designed to capture as much daylight as possible. In others, it might be a series of small desks set along a hallway. The environment was intentionally calm. Monks believed that copying sacred texts was not merely work, it was a form of devotion. Silence was encouraged. Conversation was minimal. Each monk focused on the page in front of him. Imagine sitting at one of these desks. Before you lies a sheet of parchment stretched flat on a wooden surface. Beside it sits a small container of ink made from soot, plant extracts, and other ingredients carefully mixed by the monastery. Your writing tool is a quill made from a feather, usually from a goose. And in front of you sits the manuscript you must copy. Every word must be reproduced exactly. The daily rhythm of the monks. Life in a medieval monastery followed a strict schedule. The day began before sunrise with prayers. Then came work. Some monks worked in fields. Others baked bread or brewed ale. But the scribes went to the scriptorium. They would sit at their desks for hours at a time, copying texts line by line. Their work required intense concentration. If a mistake occurred, correcting it was not simple. Scraping ink from parchment could damage the surface. Sometimes a monk would carefully erase a word by scraping the parchment with a small knife. Other times the mistake remained. In fact, historians today can sometimes trace copying errors that passed from manuscript to manuscript for centuries. Even the most careful scribes were human. The cost of a book. To understand why this work mattered, it helps to consider how difficult it was to produce a single medieval book. First came the parchment. Producing enough parchment for one large book might require the skins of dozens of animals. Each skin had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped, and dried to create a smooth writing surface. Then came the writing itself. Copying a large manuscript could take months or even years. And after the text was written, another group of specialists might add decorations and illustrations, known as illuminations. These colorful designs often used expensive pigments made from crushed minerals and plants. When the pages were finished, they were sewn together and bound into a book. The final result was incredibly valuable. Some books were worth more than farmland, which meant that monasteries treated their libraries with great care. The types of texts monks copied. Many of the books copied in monasteries were religious. Scriptures, commentaries, prayers. But monks also preserved something else, the writings of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers. Works by philosophers, historians, and scientists survived largely because monks chose to copy them. Texts by figures like Aristotle and Cicero continued to circulate in medieval libraries thanks to this quiet labor. The monks did not necessarily copy these works because they agreed with every idea inside them. Sometimes they copied them simply because they believed knowledge itself was worth preserving. And so the scriptorium became a bridge between ancient civilizations and the future. The monks behind the pages. Most of the monks who worked as scribes remain anonymous. Unlike famous scholars or authors, scribes rarely signed their work. But occasionally, a monk would leave a small personal note at the end of a manuscript. These notes, called colophons, give us rare glimpses into the lives of the scribes. Some are humorous. One medieval scribe wrote, Writing bends the back, pushes the ribs into the stomach, and brings pain to the kidneys. Another wrote simply, "Now I have written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." These small comments remind us that behind every page of medieval writing was a person sitting patiently with aching hands and tired eyes. The challenge of candlelight. While scriptoria were designed to capture daylight, winter months presented a problem. The days were short. Clouds often darkened the sky, and copying manuscripts required steady light. So monks sometimes continued their work by candlelight. The flicker of a candle made writing more difficult. Shadows moved across the page. Ink could blur if the hand slipped. Yet the work continued. Hour after hour, word after word. In these quiet rooms, knowledge slowly moved from one page to another. The unexpected travelers of knowledge. Monasteries were not isolated forever. Pilgrims visited them. Scholars traveled between them. Manuscripts sometimes moved from one monastery library to another. In this way, texts spread across medieval Europe. A book copied in an Irish monastery might eventually appear in a library in France. Another copied in Italy might find its way north into German lands. Over generations, these copies created a network of knowledge stretching across the continent. The monks themselves rarely traveled far, but their writing did. The preservation of the past. Many works from the ancient world survive today because they passed through medieval scriptoria. Historians studying the Roman Empire often rely on manuscripts preserved by monks centuries later. Philosophical ideas that shaped modern thought were transmitted through these handwritten pages. Even scientific observations from ancient scholars survived because someone in a monastery decided they were worth copying. The monks did not know how important their work would become. They were simply following the routines of monastic life. But their quiet dedication preserved voices from centuries before them. A strange paradox. Here is the curious thing. Many of the monks copying ancient texts lived lives intentionally separated from the outside world. Monasteries were places of prayer and contemplation, not centers of worldly activity. Yet within their walls, monks were preserving the intellectual heritage of civilizations that had long since vanished. While kingdoms rose and fell outside the monastery gates, scribes continued copying texts day after day. Their work was slow, often unnoticed, sometimes monotonous. But over centuries, that repetition created one of the most important cultural archives in human history. The sound of a scriptorium. If you stood quietly in a medieval scriptorium, you would hear almost nothing. No conversations, no machinery, only a few gentle sounds. The scratch of quills on parchment, the soft turning of pages, occasionally the drip of ink from a pen, perhaps the distant ringing of a monastery bell. It is easy to imagine how ordinary the moment might have felt to the monks themselves. Just another day, another page, another book slowly taking shape. Yet each of those pages carried knowledge forward through time. A quiet question. As the candle burns lower and the monk sets down his quill, he may not realize that the manuscript he just copied will survive for centuries. It may pass through many hands. It may travel across countries. It may even become the only surviving copy of a work written 1,000 years earlier. Which raises an intriguing question. How did these quiet scriptoria filled with monks patiently copying texts eventually become the foundation for one of the most revolutionary inventions in human history? Because centuries later, a new machine would appear in Europe that could produce books faster than any scribe could imagine. And when that invention arrived, the entire world of handwritten manuscripts would begin to change forever. If you return to the scriptorium the next morning, very little has changed. The same wooden desks stand in rows near the windows. The same quiet light filters through thick glass or sometimes simply open shutters. Outside, the monastery garden is damp with morning dew. Inside, the monks are already working. One monk bends over a page, carefully forming letters with slow precision. Another pauses to dip his quill into a small jar of ink. A third gently scrapes a mistake from parchment with the tip of a knife. The room is almost silent. And yet something extraordinary is happening here. Word by word, sentence by sentence, entire libraries are being recreated by hand. Preparing the page. Before a monk can even begin writing, the parchment must be prepared carefully. A fresh sheet of parchment is not automatically smooth or ready for writing. It must first be treated with fine powders, sometimes chalk or pumice, to create a slightly rough surface that holds ink. Then the monk draws guidelines across the page. These lines are not always visible in the finished manuscript, but they guide the writing so that the text remains straight and evenly spaced. A pointed stylus might be used to lightly scratch these lines into the parchment. Some pages also include margins for notes or decoration. Only when the page is properly prepared does the monk begin copying the text. The process is patient and deliberate. There is no rushing. The shape of medieval letters. Medieval scribes did not all write in the same style. Over time, monasteries developed different scripts, distinct ways of forming letters that were easier to read or faster to write. One particularly important script developed under the influence of Charlemagne during the late 8th and early 9th centuries. This style, called Carolingian minuscule, introduced clearer, more uniform letter shapes. Before this change, many manuscripts used writing styles that were crowded and difficult to read. Carolingian minuscule created spaces between words and more consistent letter forms. It may seem like a small improvement, but it made reading and copying texts far easier. In fact, many modern lowercase letters trace their origins back to this medieval script. So the shapes you use today when writing may quietly echo the handwriting of monks from over 1,000 years ago. The role of the illuminators. Not all monks in the scriptorium were scribes. Some specialized in illumination, the art of decorating manuscripts with colorful designs and illustrations. These illuminators worked after the main text was copied. They added elaborate capital letters at the beginning of chapters, sometimes filled with swirling patterns of plants, animals, or symbolic figures. Gold leaf was occasionally applied to create glowing decorations that reflected candlelight. These shining details gave illuminated manuscripts their name. Producing these decorations required careful skill. Pigments were made from unusual materials. Blue might come from crushed lapis lazuli, red from minerals or insects, green from copper compounds. Preparing these pigments was almost like performing chemistry in miniature. The illuminator ground the materials into powder, mixed them with binding agents, and applied them with delicate brushes. The final pages could be astonishingly beautiful. Yet they were also fragile works of art, easily damaged if handled carelessly. The physical toll of writing. Copying manuscripts may sound peaceful, but it was physically demanding work. Scribes spent long hours hunched over desks. Their backs often ached from bending forward. Their fingers stiffened from gripping quills. Eyes strained to read small letters under limited light. Some scribes complained openly in the notes they left behind. One wrote that copying books caused pain in the neck and weakness in the stomach. Another simply ended his manuscript with the words, "Thank God it is finished." These remarks give us a glimpse of the human side of the work. Even though the task was considered holy or scholarly, it was still labor. And like any labor, it came with fatigue. The danger of mistakes. In modern books, if a printing mistake occurs, it can be corrected in the next edition. But medieval scribes had far fewer options. If a mistake appeared early in the manuscript, correcting it might involve scraping away the ink and carefully rewriting the word. If the mistake appeared later, the scribe might simply add a correction in the margin. Sometimes, a monk copying a text would accidentally skip a line because two sentences ended with similar words. This type of error, called homoeodoulton, appears in many surviving manuscripts. When later scribes copied that manuscript, they sometimes repeated the same mistake. Over centuries, historians studying manuscripts must compare many versions of the same text to determine what the original might have said. So even today, the quiet work of medieval scribes continues to influence how scholars reconstruct ancient writings. Monasteries as libraries. As manuscripts accumulated, monasteries gradually built libraries. Some were small collections stored in wooden chests. Others became large rooms filled with shelves of carefully bound books. Books were valuable objects, so monasteries often chained them to reading desks to prevent theft. Visitors sometimes described these libraries with admiration. Inside them rested not only religious texts, but also works on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and history. In many cases, the monastery library became the most important center of learning for miles around. Students traveled long distances to study there. Scholars borrowed manuscripts to copy or translate them. In this way, monasteries served as both workshops and archives. The long journey of a manuscript. Imagine the life of a single manuscript. First, it is written by an ancient author centuries earlier. Then a monk in a distant monastery copies it carefully onto new parchment. Another monastery later copies that version again. Perhaps a traveling scholar borrows it and carries it to another region. Over time, the manuscript is copied again and again. Each copy preserves the text a little longer. Without this chain of copying, many ancient works would simply disappear. Fire, moisture, insects, and neglect constantly threatened medieval books. The act of copying was the only reliable defense against those dangers. Every new copy gave the text another chance to survive. The intellectual curiosity of monks. Although monks often lived quiet lives, many were deeply curious about the world. Some studied astronomy. Others copied medical texts. A few experimented with early forms of science. One notable example is Roger Bacon, a 13th century thinker interested in optics, mathematics, and experimental methods. While Bacon himself was not simply a scribe, the manuscripts he studied and wrote depended on generations of copying. Without those manuscripts, his research would have had no foundation. In this way, the work of scribes quietly supported intellectual progress. Even discoveries that came centuries later depended on preserved texts from earlier times. The slow spread of literacy. For most of the medieval period, books remained rare. Producing them required too much labor for them to become common objects. But over time, the number of manuscripts slowly increased. Universities began to appear in cities such as Paris and Bologna. Students needed textbooks. Scholars needed reference works. The demand for copied texts grew steadily. Some monasteries struggled to keep up with requests. Professional scribes outside monasteries also began copying books for universities and wealthy patrons. The world of written knowledge was expanding, but the process remained slow. Even a skilled scribe might copy only a few pages per day. And then, in the 15th century, a new invention appeared that would completely transform this system. the moment before the revolution. For centuries, monks had been the guardians of written knowledge. Their careful copying preserved ancient ideas and religious teachings. Their libraries protected manuscripts from loss. Their scriptoria produced the books that scholars depended on. But all of this depended on one simple fact. Every book had to be written by hand. That meant every copy required hours of patient labor. And as the demand for books increased, the limits of this system became more obvious. People wanted more books than scribes could produce. A faster method seemed almost impossible. Yet somewhere in the German city of Mainz, a craftsman was experimenting with a new idea. An idea that would allow a single text to be reproduced hundreds of times with astonishing speed. His name was Johannes Gutenberg. And when his machine began producing printed pages, the quiet world of the medieval scriptorium would begin to change forever. If you step into a medieval scriptorium in the early 15th century, everything still appears familiar. The wooden desks are arranged near the windows. The shelves hold carefully bound manuscripts. A few monks sit quietly copying lines of text onto parchment. The sounds are the same as they have been for centuries. Quills scratching, pages turning, ink being mixed. The rhythm of the work has barely changed since the early Middle Ages. And yet, beyond the monastery walls, something new is beginning to take shape. In a workshop in the German city of Mainz, a man named Johannes Gutenberg is experimenting with a machine that could change the future of books forever. The monks copying manuscripts by candlelight do not yet know it. But the world of handwritten texts is about to face a quiet revolution. The limits of hand copying. For centuries, the scriptorium system had worked well enough. Books were rare, but they survived. Libraries slowly grew. Scholars could study ancient texts preserved through generations of copying. But by the 15th century, Europe was changing. Universities were expanding. Cities were growing. Trade networks were becoming more active again. More people wanted books than ever before. Yet even the most skilled scribes could only produce a limited number. A long manuscript might take months to copy. A large library required the labor of many scribes over many years. The demand for written knowledge was beginning to exceed the capacity of the scriptoria. Something faster was needed. Gutenberg's experiment. Johannes Gutenberg was not originally trying to compete with monks. He was a craftsman skilled in metalworking and engraving. At some point in the early 1400s, he began experimenting with a new idea: movable metal type. Instead of carving an entire page into a wooden block, as some earlier printers had done, Gutenberg created individual metal letters. Each letter could be arranged into words and lines. Once a page of type was assembled, ink could be applied and the page pressed onto paper. After printing, the letters could be rearranged to print a different page. This meant that a single set of metal letters could produce hundreds of identical pages. The process was far faster than copying by hand. The first printed books. Around 1455, Gutenberg completed one of his most famous projects, a printed edition of the Bible. Today it is known as the Gutenberg Bible. The pages were printed with remarkable clarity. The letters were uniform and precise. Many copies were later decorated by hand with colorful initials, giving them an appearance similar to traditional manuscripts. But the real difference lay in the speed of production. Dozens of copies could be produced in the time it once took to write a single manuscript. For the first time in European history, books could be reproduced quickly and consistently. The quiet rhythm of the scriptorium suddenly faced a powerful new competitor. How monasteries responded. The arrival of printing did not instantly eliminate the work of scribes. For a time, handwritten manuscripts and printed books existed side by side. Some monasteries even welcomed the new technology. Printed books made it easier to obtain copies of important texts. Libraries could expand more quickly. Scholars could compare different editions of the same work. But the role of the scribe slowly began to change. Where once monks spent years copying entire manuscripts, now many of those texts could be purchased in printed form. Scriptoria that had been busy workshops for centuries gradually grew quieter. The monks who once copied books line by line found fewer requests for their work. The spread of printing. After Gutenberg's invention proved successful, printing presses spread rapidly across Europe. Within decades, presses appeared in cities such as Venice, Paris, and London. Printers produced religious texts, legal documents, classical literature, and scientific works. Books became far more common than they had ever been before. The number of copies available increased dramatically. Ideas that once circulated slowly through handwritten manuscripts now traveled quickly in printed form. Scholars in different countries could read the same texts. Debates and discoveries spread more rapidly. The intellectual landscape of Europe began to transform. The hidden foundation. And yet, even as printing revolutionized book production, it depended heavily on something that already existed. Manuscripts. Before printers could produce books, they needed texts to print. Many of those texts survived only because monks had copied them over centuries. Ancient philosophy, Roman history, medical knowledge, classical poetry. Without the careful preservation carried out in medieval scriptoria, much of that knowledge might have disappeared long before the printing press arrived. The printed book was powerful, but it was built on a foundation created by generations of patient scribes. The monks who preserved the past. If you step back and look at the entire story, the quiet labor of medieval monks becomes even more remarkable. They did not invent the ideas they copied. Many of the works they preserved were written centuries before they were born. Yet by copying them faithfully, they carried those ideas across time. A manuscript written in ancient Greece might be copied in a medieval monastery, then printed centuries later, and eventually studied in a modern university. Each stage depended on the one before it. And at the center of that chain were the monks patiently writing page after page by hand. A library that survived the centuries. Some medieval manuscripts copied in monasteries still exist today. They are preserved in museums and libraries, protected carefully from light and moisture. The parchment pages are often yellowed with age. The ink has faded slightly, but the words remain readable. When historians examine these manuscripts, they can sometimes identify the style of the scribe who wrote them. Different monasteries developed distinctive writing traditions. Even small variations in letter shapes can reveal where and when a manuscript was produced. In this way, each manuscript becomes a kind of historical artifact, a quiet record of the person who once sat at a desk, carefully forming letters under the dim glow of candlelight. The human story behind the pages. It is easy to focus on the books themselves, the knowledge they contain, the authors who wrote them. But there is another story hidden behind those pages. The story of the people who preserved them. Monks who woke before dawn, prepared parchment, mixed ink, and spent hours copying texts they might not fully understand, but believed were important enough to save. Their work rarely brought fame. Their names were seldom recorded. Yet their labor helped preserve centuries of human thought. Without them, entire chapters of history might have vanished. The quiet end of an era. By the 16th century, the world of books had changed dramatically. Printing presses produced thousands of volumes. Libraries expanded rapidly. Literacy slowly increased among the population. Scriptoria still existed in some monasteries, but their role had diminished. The age of handwritten manuscripts as the primary method of preserving texts was coming to an end. But the centuries of copying that came before had already accomplished something extraordinary. They carried knowledge across one of the most uncertain periods in European history. A final reflection. The monks of the medieval scriptoria did not set out to change the world. Most simply followed the rhythms of monastic life. Prayer, work, study, rest, day after day. Yet in their quiet rooms filled with parchment and candlelight, they performed one of the most important acts in the history of knowledge. They kept the past alive. Their work reminds us that history is not always shaped by dramatic moments. Sometimes it is shaped by patience, by repetition, by people doing careful work that no one else notices, and by the belief that preserving knowledge matters, even when the future is uncertain. A question for the next story. If you follow the thread of quiet workers through history, you begin to see them everywhere. In monasteries copying books, on Roman roads laying stone, and in the early mornings of great cities, preparing something far more ordinary but equally essential. Because long before dawn, while most of the population still slept, there were workers kneading dough, lighting ovens, and preparing bread for entire cities. Their work fed soldiers, merchants, scholars, and emperors alike. And in one vast empire that stretched across 3 continents, these bakers played a surprisingly important role in keeping urban life running smoothly. Who were the bakers who woke before sunrise in the cities of the Ottoman world, and how did their daily labor help sustain one of history's longest-lasting empires? Story 3. The Ottoman bakers who fed an empire before dawn. If you walked through the streets of Istanbul sometime in the 16th century, long before sunrise, you would find the city strangely quiet. The markets are closed. The mosques are dark except for a few flickering lamps. Most homes remain silent as families sleep behind wooden doors and shuttered windows. But if you follow the narrow streets carefully, you might notice something unusual. A warm smell drifting through the cool night air. Bread. Somewhere nearby, an oven is already burning. Inside a small bakery, men are awake and working while the rest of the city sleeps. Their hands move steadily through familiar motions, mixing flour, kneading dough, shaping loaves. By the time the first call to prayer echoes across the city at dawn, thousands of fresh loaves must already be ready. Because in a city as large as Istanbul, feeding the population every single day requires a remarkable level of organization. And at the center of that effort stand the bakers, a city that needed bread. During the height of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul was one of the largest cities in the world. By the 16th century, historians estimate the population may have reached 500,000 people, sometimes even more. Feeding a city of that size required enormous quantities of food. Grain shipments arrived constantly from across the empire. Farmers in the Balkans grew wheat. Merchants transported it by ship across the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Warehouses stored it near the city's harbors. But grain alone was not enough. Someone still had to turn it into bread. And that work happened every night in hundreds of bakeries scattered throughout the city. The Bakers' Guild. Ottoman cities organized many professions through guilds, associations that regulated trades and protected standards of quality. The bakers belonged to one such organization. Guild rules controlled almost every aspect of their work. How much bread could cost, how large a loaf had to be, how much flour could be used. Inspectors visited bakeries regularly to ensure that no baker cheated customers by making loaves smaller than required. Bread was too important to leave unregulated. If bakers began cutting corners, the consequences could quickly spread across the city. Angry crowds might gather. Food shortages could spark unrest. So the Ottoman government monitored the bread supply carefully. In some ways, bakers held one of the most politically sensitive jobs in the entire empire. The night begins. The work of baking started long before dawn. A baker's shift often began around midnight. The ovens needed hours to heat properly. Fuel, usually wood, was stacked inside the oven and burned until the stone interior reached the right temperature. While the fire burned, the bakers prepared the dough. Large wooden troughs held flour, water, and yeast. The bakers mixed these ingredients with strong, practiced movements. Kneading dough is physically demanding. It requires pushing, folding, and turning the mixture again and again until it becomes smooth and elastic. A bakery producing hundreds of loaves might require several workers kneading simultaneously. The rhythm of their work filled the room. Hands pressing, dough folding, wooden tables creaking under the weight. The grain that fed the empire. The bread in Ottoman cities depended heavily on grain shipments arriving from distant regions. One important source was the fertile lands around the Black Sea. From there, ships carried wheat into the Bosporus Strait, delivering cargo to the bustling harbors of Istanbul. The flow of grain was so important that Ottoman authorities closely supervised it. If merchants tried to export too much grain abroad, the government sometimes intervened. The priority was clear: the capital must be fed first. The Ottoman sultans understood that hungry cities could become dangerous places. One of the rulers who oversaw the empire during its peak was Suleiman the Magnificent. During his reign in the 16th century, the empire stretched across 3 continents. Maintaining stability across such a vast territory required attention not only to military power, but also to basic necessities like food. Bread, simple as it seemed, was part of the system that kept the empire functioning. The shape of Ottoman bread. Not all bread looked the same. In Istanbul bakeries, bakers produced several types depending on local customs and ingredients. One common variety resembled flatbread, baked quickly in hot ovens. Others were round loaves with slightly crisp crusts and soft interiors. Some breads were sprinkled with sesame seeds. Others were shaped into rings similar to modern simit, a type of bread still popular in Turkey today. Each neighborhood bakery developed its own style and reputation. Customers often returned to the same bakery every morning, trusting the baker to provide consistent quality. Bread was not just food. It was part of daily life. The sound of the bakery. If you stood quietly inside a bakery before dawn, you would notice the steady rhythm of work. Wood crackling inside the oven. Dough thumping onto wooden tables. Metal tools scraping flour from surfaces. Occasionally, a baker calls out to another worker across the room. Outside, the city remains dark. But inside the bakery, the heat of the oven fills the air. Sweat gathers on the bakers' foreheads as they move quickly to shape the rising dough into loaves. Timing is important. If the dough rises too long, the bread may collapse. If it bakes too quickly, the crust burns before the inside cooks properly. Years of experience teach bakers how to judge the exact moment when the bread is ready. Bread for every class. One interesting detail about Ottoman bread is that different types existed for different social groups. Wealthier households sometimes purchased whiter bread made from more finely sifted flour. Poorer families often bought darker loaves made from grain that still contained parts of the bran. But regardless of social class, bread remained a central part of the daily diet. Many meals consisted simply of bread, combined with olives, cheese, or vegetables. Even soldiers marching in the Ottoman army relied heavily on bread rations. So while the bakers worked quietly through the night, their labor touched nearly every life in the city. Dawn arrives. As the first light appears over the domes and minarets of Istanbul, the bakeries begin to open. Customers arrive carrying small baskets or cloth bags. Some come before heading to work. Others send children to purchase bread for the family breakfast. Fresh loaves are stacked behind the counter, still warm from the oven. The smell of baked bread drifts out into the streets. Within an hour, most of the night's production is gone. And the bakers, who have been working for hours already, finally begin to slow down. Their work is largely invisible to the rest of the city. By the time most people wake up, the bread is simply there. Ready. Expected. Taken for granted. The invisible workers. Like the Roman road builders or the monks of the scriptoria, the bakers rarely appeared in grand historical records. Historians wrote about wars, treaties, and rulers. But the daily labor that fed cities often went unnoticed. Yet without these bakers, urban life would have been impossible. Cities depended on reliable food supplies. And bread was the simplest, most essential form of nourishment. Every loaf represented hours of quiet labor performed while the city slept. A quiet question. As the sun rises higher above the skyline of Istanbul, the bakery grows quieter. The ovens cool. Flour dust settles on the wooden tables. The bakers finally rest after their long shift. But the story of bread in the Ottoman Empire is not always peaceful. Because when bread became scarce, or when people believed bakers were cheating them, the reaction in the streets could be swift and intense. Crowds could gather. Anger could spread. And sometimes the fate of a baker could depend on forces far beyond the walls of his small shop. Which raises an important question. What happened in an empire where bread was so essential that even small disruptions in its supply could threaten the stability of an entire city? If you return to the bakery later that same morning in Istanbul, the atmosphere is very different. The rush of customers has already passed. The baskets that once held dozens of fresh loaves are now nearly empty. Only a few crumbs remain scattered across the wooden counter. The bakers are tired. They have already been working for 8 or 9 hours. Some sit quietly near the door, drinking water or tea. Others begin cleaning the flour-covered tables. Outside, the city has fully awakened. Merchants open their stalls. Donkeys pull carts through narrow streets. Boats cross the waters of the Bosporus carrying goods from one shore to the other. And across the city, thousands of people are eating the bread baked only a few hours earlier. The entire urban routine depends on this nightly cycle. But because bread is so essential, the Ottoman authorities watch the bakeries carefully. The government and the price of bread. In many societies throughout history, bread has been more than just food. It has been a political issue. If the price of bread rises too high, people become angry very quickly. The Ottoman government understood this well. Officials regularly set official bread prices to ensure that bakers could not charge excessive amounts. Inspectors visited bakeries to weigh loaves and check whether they met the required standards. If a loaf was too small or too light, the baker could face punishment. Sometimes fines were imposed. In more serious cases, bakers might lose their license to operate. The authorities wanted to prevent something dangerous, the belief that bakers were cheating the public. Even rumors of dishonest bread could cause unrest. The city inspectors. Ottoman cities employed officials whose job was to monitor markets and trades. One important figure was the muhtasib, a kind of market inspector. The muhtasib walked through neighborhoods checking scales, inspecting goods, and making sure that guild regulations were followed. Bakeries were among the places he visited most often. He might arrive unannounced in the early morning, stepping inside while the bakers were still working. The loaves would be weighed, the flour inspected. If something seemed suspicious, the baker might have to explain himself immediately. These inspections were not only about fairness. They were about maintaining order in a very large city. Bread riots. Despite these regulations, tensions sometimes arose. If grain shipments arrived late, bread supplies could shrink. Bad harvests in distant provinces could raise the cost of flour. And when bread became scarce, urban populations often reacted strongly. Throughout history, many cities have experienced bread riots. Crowds gather outside bakeries, demanding lower prices or larger loaves. Sometimes they accuse bakers of hiding flour or secretly raising prices. In such moments, the baker becomes the visible face of a much larger problem. People rarely blame distant harvest failures or transportation issues. Instead, they blame the person standing behind the counter. The baker. Ottoman officials worked hard to prevent these situations. Keeping bread available and affordable was one of the quiet priorities of governing a large city. The supply chain of an empire. Behind each loaf of bread lay a long chain of people and places. Farmers in the Balkans planted wheat in vast fields. Harvest workers gathered the grain under hot summer sun. Merchants purchased the harvest and arranged transportation. Ships loaded with sacks of wheat sailed across the Black Sea. At the harbors of Istanbul, porters unloaded the cargo and carried it to warehouses. Millers then ground the grain into flour using heavy millstones. Only after all of that did the flour finally reach the bakery. The baker's work was the final step in a much larger system. And if any part of that system failed, the effects would quickly reach the city. The importance of the capital. Istanbul was not just any city. It was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, it served as the political, economic, and cultural center of a territory stretching from North Africa to Eastern Europe. Keeping the capital well supplied was therefore a major priority. One of the rulers who presided over this vast empire was Mehmed II. After capturing the city in 1453, Mehmed worked to rebuild and expand it. Markets were restored. Trade routes were encouraged. Food supplies were carefully managed. The city gradually grew into one of the largest urban centers in the world. And every day, thousands of bakers played their small but essential role in feeding its population. The community bakery. In many neighborhoods, the local bakery became an important social space. People did not simply purchase bread and leave. They exchanged news, discussed politics, shared gossip about neighbors. Children sometimes lingered outside, watching the bakers slide long wooden paddles into the ovens. The smell of fresh bread attracted attention from anyone passing by. In this way, bakeries became part of the social life of the city. They were places where everyday conversations happened, quiet corners of urban life that rarely appeared in official histories. The craft of the baker. Becoming a baker required training. Young apprentices often began working in bakeries as teenagers. They learned how to measure flour by eye, how to judge the temperature of an oven, and how to shape dough into consistent loaves. These skills could take years to master. A good baker developed an instinct for the behavior of dough. Too much water made the bread heavy. Too little yeast slowed the rising process. Ovens needed careful management to avoid burning the crust while leaving the inside uncooked. These were practical forms of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. No written manual could fully replace experience. The rhythm of the week. Although baking happened daily, certain days brought special demands. Before religious festivals or major gatherings, bakeries often produced extra loaves. Families preparing large meals might purchase more bread than usual. Street vendors sometimes bought bread in bulk to sell alongside soups or roasted meats. The bakery had to anticipate these changes. Running out of bread too early could frustrate customers. Baking too much could waste precious flour. The baker constantly balanced supply and demand, guided by experience and observation. The invisible backbone. Looking back at the story of the Ottoman Empire, historians often focus on grand events. The expansion of territory, diplomatic negotiations, the achievements of powerful sultans. But none of those events would have mattered if the capital city itself could not function. And cities function because people eat. Every day, without interruption, the bakers of Istanbul provided that reliability. Night after night, year after year, their work was repetitive, often exhausting, and rarely celebrated. Yet without them, the great city could not have sustained its enormous population. The afternoon silence. By the afternoon, the bakery grows quiet again. The ovens are cool. The last customers have left. Outside, the streets buzz with activity as merchants sell spices, fabrics, and fruits in crowded markets. Inside the bakery, the workers rest. Soon they will sleep for a few hours, because their next shift will begin long before the city wakes again. The cycle never truly stops. Bread must always be ready by morning. A quiet question. Watching this daily rhythm, it becomes clear that feeding a city requires more than just skilled bakers. It requires the cooperation of farmers, merchants, sailors, porters, and millers across an entire empire. The baker is only the final link in a long chain of labor. And this raises an interesting question. If bread required such a complex network of workers and supplies, what happened when that network was disrupted by war, storms, or political conflict? Because in a vast empire stretching across continents, the journey from wheat field to bakery oven was not always smooth. Sometimes a single broken link could threaten the food supply of an entire city. As evening approaches in Istanbul, the city begins to slow. Market stalls close one by one. Merchants count coins earned during the day. Families return home through narrow streets that twist between wooden houses and stone buildings. The smell of cooked food drifts from kitchen windows. But while most of the city prepares for sleep, the bakers know that their next shift is approaching. In only a few hours, the work will begin again. Because in a city of hundreds of thousands of people, bread cannot wait. Every day must begin with fresh loaves. And so the quiet cycle continues. When the supply was threatened, although the baking routine seemed steady, the system behind it was delicate. The city depended on a constant flow of grain arriving from distant provinces. If storms delayed ships crossing the Black Sea, the supply of wheat could shrink. If harvests failed in farming regions, flour became more expensive. And if wars disrupted trade routes, the capital could face real shortages. Ottoman rulers understood the danger of these disruptions. A hungry city was unpredictable. Even small shortages could cause anxiety among the population. That is why imperial officials worked constantly to secure reliable grain shipments for the capital. Keeping bread available was not simply an economic concern. It was a matter of political stability. The ships of grain. Much of Istanbul's grain arrived by ship. Large vessels sailed across the Black Sea carrying cargo from fertile agricultural regions. Among the important sources of grain were the lands surrounding the Danube River and the northern shores of the Black Sea. One port city frequently involved in this trade was Odessa, which later became an important grain export center in the region. Although trade routes changed over centuries, the general pattern remained the same. Grain flowed toward the Ottoman capital. When these ships approached the Bosporus Strait, they carried the food that would soon become the city's bread. Dockworkers unloaded the sacks. Carters transported them to storage warehouses. From there, millers turned the grain into flour. Only then did the flour reach the bakeries scattered across the city. The baker's responsibility. Once the flour arrived, the responsibility passed to the bakers. Each loaf had to meet the standards expected by both customers and officials. The guild system ensured that bakers followed rules designed to protect the public. A baker who cheated by reducing the size of loaves or using poor quality flour risked punishment. In some cases, authorities displayed dishonest bakers publicly to warn others. Such punishments may seem harsh today, but they reflected how seriously the Ottoman government viewed the bread supply. Bread was not merely a commodity. It was a basic necessity that affected the mood of the entire city. Feeding the army. Bread was not only for civilians. The Ottoman military relied heavily on grain-based foods during campaigns. Armies marching across long distances needed reliable rations. Flatbread and dried biscuit-like loaves could travel well and last longer than fresh bread. During large military campaigns, bakeries and mobile ovens sometimes accompanied the army. Soldiers needed food every day, just like the population back home. So even far from the capital, bakers quietly supported the empire's military operations. One of the powerful rulers who commanded such armies was Selim I, whose early 16th century campaigns expanded Ottoman territory dramatically. Behind those military successes stood countless workers supplying food and equipment, including bakers. The social role of bread. Bread also carried cultural meaning in Ottoman society. Sharing bread was often seen as a symbol of hospitality. Guests were welcomed with meals that almost always included bread. Families gathered around tables where bread accompanied soups, vegetables, and meats. Street vendors sold snacks wrapped in pieces of bread. Children carried bread home from the bakery for breakfast. In this way, bread connected people across social classes. Rich households might serve more refined dishes, while poorer families ate simpler meals. But bread appeared at almost every table. The endurance of tradition. Many of the baking traditions developed in the Ottoman period still survive today. Modern bakeries across Turkey continue producing breads similar to those baked centuries ago. Ring-shaped simit, often coated in sesame seeds, is still sold on city streets. Flatbreads and round loaves remain staples of daily meals. Although ovens are now powered by modern fuels and bakeries operate during daylight hours, the basic craft remains recognizable. Flour, water, yeast, heat, the same simple ingredients that Ottoman bakers worked with long ago. The invisible night workers. It is easy to forget how much effort lies behind something as ordinary as a loaf of bread. By the time people buy bread in the morning, the work is already finished. The ovens have cooled, the bakers are tired, and the city moves on with its day. But behind that simple purchase stands a long chain of labor stretching across fields, ships, mills, and bakeries. Farmers planted the wheat. Sailors carried it across the sea. Millers ground it into flour. And bakers turned it into food. Each step depended on the others. The pattern of quiet workers. When you step back and look at history carefully, you begin to notice a pattern. Great empires often appear to be built by powerful leaders. But in reality, they depend on countless workers performing quiet, repetitive tasks. Roman road builders laying stone mile after mile. Monks copying manuscripts by candlelight. Bakers kneading dough while cities sleep. None of these people commanded armies or ruled provinces. Yet their work made the larger system possible. Without roads, armies could not move. Without manuscripts, knowledge could not survive. Without bread, cities could not function. A walk through the sleeping city. Imagine walking through Istanbul late at night again. The streets are dimly lit. Most houses are silent. But if you listen carefully, you might hear faint sounds drifting from a nearby bakery. Wood cracking inside an oven. Dough being kneaded on a wooden table. The quiet rhythm of work beginning once more. While the city sleeps, the bakers are already preparing tomorrow's bread. Their labor rarely appears in historical records. Yet every morning when the sun rises, their work is visible everywhere in the baskets carried home from the bakery and in the meals shared around family tables. The quiet legacy. The Ottoman Empire lasted for more than 6 centuries. Its history includes wars, diplomacy, architecture, and political intrigue. But behind those dramatic events stood the everyday systems that allowed life to continue. Food supply was one of the most important. The bakers who worked through the night helped maintain the stability of the capital for generations. Their labor did not win battles or sign treaties, but it fed the people who did. And sometimes the simplest work, kneading dough, lighting ovens, baking bread, can quietly sustain an empire. Looking ahead, if you continue searching for these overlooked workers across history, you begin to find them everywhere. Not only in cities, monasteries, and construction sites, but also along rivers and canals, where enormous engineering projects reshaped entire landscapes. Because in another part of the world, thousands of laborers once spent years digging waterways that transformed trade, agriculture, and transportation for millions of people. Their work was muddy, exhausting, and rarely recorded in detail. Yet the canals they built helped sustain one of the largest empires in human history. Who were the workers who dug those waterways, and how did their labor quietly reshape the landscape of imperial China? Story 4. The canal diggers who quietly reshaped Qing China. If you stand beside a quiet canal somewhere in eastern China early in the morning, the water often looks perfectly still. Mist rises gently from the surface. Fishing boats drift slowly between grassy banks. Reeds sway in the breeze. At first glance, the canal might seem like a natural part of the landscape, as if the water has always flowed this way. But many of these waterways are not natural rivers at all. They are the result of enormous human labor. Long before modern machines existed, thousands of workers dug canals across the Chinese countryside using little more than shovels, baskets, and determination. Their work helped feed cities, transport goods, and stabilize one of the largest empires in the world. Yet the canal diggers themselves rarely appear in the grand stories of imperial history. A civilization of rivers. China has always been shaped by water. Great rivers such as the Yellow River and the Yangtze River flow across vast distances, nourishing farmland and supporting millions of people. But rivers alone were not always enough. Some regions had abundant grain, but lacked direct routes to major cities. Other regions needed irrigation during dry seasons. Transporting goods by land over long distances was slow and expensive. So for centuries, Chinese rulers turned to an ambitious solution: canals. By connecting rivers with artificial waterways, the empire could create an enormous transportation network. Boats carrying rice, Grain, timber, and other goods could travel hundreds of miles across inland water routes. And behind every mile of canal stood thousands of laborers who had dug it by hand. The great artery of the empire. One of the most famous examples of this system is the Grand Canal. Stretching over 1,700 kilometers, the Grand Canal became the longest artificial waterway in the world. It connected northern and southern China, linking major cities and agricultural regions. The canal system existed long before the Qing dynasty, but it remained crucial during Qing rule. It allowed rice grown in the fertile south to be transported to northern capitals, where populations were growing rapidly. Without this steady supply of grain, cities could not survive. The canal was more than just a transportation route. It was a lifeline for the empire. The Qing dynasty's challenge. The rulers of the Qing dynasty governed China from the mid-17th century until the early 20th century. During their reign, the empire contained hundreds of millions of people. Managing such a vast population required careful attention to infrastructure. Roads and rivers mattered, but canals played a particularly important role in moving food. If the canal system failed, grain shipments could be delayed. And if grain shipments were delayed, cities might face shortages. So the Qing government constantly invested in maintaining and repairing the waterways. And that meant sending workers into the fields and riverbanks to dig, dredge, and rebuild canals again and again. The workers with shovels. Imagine arriving at a canal construction site somewhere in eastern China during the 18th century. The scene would look busy, but strangely quiet compared with modern construction projects. There are no engines, no bulldozers, no cranes. Instead, hundreds of laborers work side by side with simple tools. Shovels cut into the earth. Workers fill woven baskets with soil and carry them away on shoulder poles. Others reinforce the canal banks with packed clay or wooden supports. The process is slow. Every foot of canal requires careful digging. But over weeks and months, the trench gradually fills with water. A new section of canal is born. The seasonal workforce. Many canal workers were not permanent laborers. Instead, they were farmers temporarily assigned to construction duties during certain times of the year. When crops were not being planted or harvested, local authorities sometimes required villagers to assist with public works projects. This system provided the empire with large numbers of workers when needed. But the labor could be extremely difficult. Digging canals meant standing for long hours in muddy soil. In summer, the heat was intense. In winter, cold winds swept across open fields. Yet the work continued because the canal network was too important to neglect. The problem of sediment. One of the biggest challenges facing canal workers was sediment. Rivers like the Yellow River carry enormous amounts of silt. When this silt enters canals, it settles on the bottom and gradually fills the waterway. If enough sediment accumulates, boats can no longer pass. So canal maintenance often involved dredging, removing mud from the canal floor. Workers stood waist-deep in water using scoops and baskets to lift heavy, wet soil out of the canal. The mud was piled along the banks or carried away. It was exhausting work, repeated year after year. Yet without dredging, the canal would slowly disappear beneath layers of sediment. Grain boats on the water. When the canals functioned properly, they carried an astonishing amount of cargo. Large barges loaded with sacks of rice moved slowly along the waterways. Boat crews guided the vessels using long poles or sails, depending on the conditions. In some places, teams of workers walked along the canal banks pulling boats with ropes. These cargo boats transported grain to northern cities, where the imperial government stored it in massive granaries. The grain helped feed soldiers, government officials, and urban populations. Once again, the quiet labor of canal workers supported the entire system. The importance of the capital. During much of the Qing period, the imperial capital was Beijing. Beijing lay far to the north, in a region that produced less rice than southern provinces. That meant enormous quantities of grain had to be transported across the empire to feed the capital's residents. The Grand Canal made this possible. Without it, moving such large amounts of food over land would have been far more difficult. So maintaining the canal system was one of the government's most important logistical tasks. And once again, the responsibility for that task fell largely on ordinary workers with shovels and baskets. The long history beneath the water. Many sections of the Grand Canal had already existed for centuries before the Qing dynasty. Earlier dynasties had begun the project, connecting rivers step by step. Each generation repaired and expanded what previous generations had built. In this way, the canal became a layered achievement. Every stretch of water represented the labor of countless workers from different eras. Some dug new channels. Others repaired damaged banks. Still others dredged sediment to keep the water flowing. Together, they maintained a system that lasted for more than 1,000 years. A landscape shaped by labor. If you look at maps of eastern China today, the influence of canals is still visible. Waterways run across plains and between cities. Some are ancient routes that once carried imperial grain shipments. Others have been modernized or replaced by railways and highways. But many canals remain part of the landscape. Their quiet waters reflect centuries of effort. Each stretch of canal represents thousands of hours of labor performed by workers whose names were rarely recorded. The quiet question. As the sun sets over the canal construction site, the workers finally rest. Their clothes are covered in mud. Their muscles ache from lifting heavy baskets of earth. But the canal they have been digging is slowly taking shape. Soon water will fill the trench. Boats will pass through carrying rice toward distant cities. The workers may never see those boats or visit the cities they help feed. Their job is simply to dig. And this raises an interesting question. If the canal network was so essential to transporting food across the empire, what happened when floods, droughts, or political turmoil disrupted the delicate balance of these waterways? Because canals, like all human creations, require constant care, and sometimes even the most determined workers cannot control the forces of nature. If you return to the canal site a few weeks later, the trench that seemed slowly forming now appears more fragile than ever. A sudden rainfall has caused nearby soil to slump into the waterway. Mud clogs sections of the canal, making it impossible for cargo boats to pass. The workers, however, continue without complaint. Shovels strike into the damp earth again and again. Baskets are filled and carried away. Worn hands and aching backs push forward. The work is arduous, repetitive, and often thankless, yet the canal must function. The lifeblood of the empire depends on it. Nature's constant challenge. The Yellow River in particular was notorious for its floods. Historians sometimes called it China's sorrow because of the devastation it caused. During heavy rains, the river often overflowed, depositing thick layers of silt on farmland and canals alike. The Qing government had to constantly repair the damage. Workers were sent en masse to dredge sediment, rebuild dikes, and reinforce canal banks. Sometimes tens of thousands of laborers were mobilized simultaneously. They came from nearby villages, often conscripted for months at a time. They lived in temporary camps, sleeping in simple shelters, subsisting on meager rations. The task was grueling, physically dangerous, and rarely recognized in official histories. Yet it was essential. The labor of coordination. Managing a canal workforce was not simple. Officials had to coordinate thousands of workers across hundreds of miles of waterways. Local magistrates oversaw the labor, ensuring that quotas were met. Supervisors counted baskets of earth removed each day, checked that bank reinforcements met specifications, and reported progress back to provincial authorities. Even a small lapse could delay the arrival of grain to the capital, affecting soldiers, bureaucrats, and ordinary citizens. The empire's administration depended on a combination of meticulous record-keeping and the endurance of these workers. The canal in the capital. The Grand Canal's northern terminus near Beijing was particularly vital. Rice, wheat, and other essential goods arrived here first. Massive granaries stored these supplies, ensuring that the capital's residents could eat even during shortages or emergencies. If a canal section near the north failed, boats carrying grain from southern provinces might be delayed for weeks. Such delays could provoke unrest. Citizens, already wary of high taxes and corvée labor demands, would sometimes riot if the food supply faltered. Maintaining the canal, then, was not just a logistical necessity, it was a political one. Floods and the human cost. Despite precautions, accidents occurred. Floods could sweep away temporary shelters, drown livestock, and trap workers in collapsing banks. Some laborers lost their lives in the process. Others suffered illness from exposure to water and mud. Yet the work had to continue. The bureaucracy demanded results. Delays could threaten the stability of far-off cities. The laborers' personal suffering was invisible to the emperor and the court in Beijing. Their contribution went largely unrecorded, yet it underpinned the survival of millions. The role of boats and barges. Once the canals were functional, the focus shifted to the transportation itself. Large barges moved grain across hundreds of kilometers, often pulled along by workers walking the canal banks. This method required careful timing. Barges had to navigate locks, bridges, and sometimes shallow sections. If the canal became clogged with debris, or if the banks were weak, boats could run aground or capsize. The canal workers' careful labor directly influenced the safety and efficiency of this transport network. Maintenance as a continuous process. Unlike a building, which can be completed and then left largely alone, canals demanded constant attention. Sediment needed regular dredging. Erosion had to be repaired. Wooden supports rotted over time. The work never truly ended. One rainy season might undo months of labor, forcing a return to the muddy trenches. For the Qing Empire, this continuous maintenance was critical. Cities could not wait, and the emperor's authority depended on the uninterrupted flow of food. Invisible heroes of logistics. The laborers who dug and maintained these canals were in many ways the invisible backbone of the Qing dynasty. They rarely appear in official records, overshadowed by emperors, generals, and scholars. Yet without their work, entire cities might have gone hungry, armies might have stalled, and rebellions could have erupted. The stability of the empire, at least in practical terms, rested as much on shovels and baskets as on policies and edicts. Human ingenuity amid labor. Workers did not simply follow orders blindly. They learned practical solutions to everyday challenges. When a section of bank kept collapsing, they reinforced it with a combination of clay, stones, and woven bamboo. When water levels fluctuated unpredictably, they devised temporary dams to manage flow. Generations of hands built knowledge that was rarely written down but applied every day, quietly sustaining the empire. The quiet power of labor. Looking at history through this lens changes the way we see empires. The Qing dynasty appeared immense and powerful from the outside. But that power relied heavily on the quiet, consistent labor of people performing tasks that would seem ordinary on the surface, digging canals, dredging sediment, carrying baskets of mud. Each foot of waterway dug, each bank reinforced, each barge successfully navigated was a testament to human endurance and ingenuity. These small, invisible acts allowed the empire to function, feed its population, and survive for centuries. A question to ponder. As the sun sets over a canal lined with bamboo and reeds, workers rest once more. The waterway reflects the sky and disappears into the distance, carrying grain toward cities they may never see. Their labor is repetitive, exhausting, and largely forgotten. And yet, history itself depends on it. If the survival of an empire can hinge on the daily work of thousands of unseen laborers, what other forms of quiet, repetitive work across time have shaped the course of human civilization? Perhaps in the deserts of Egypt, the mines of the Americas, or the fields of Europe, countless other workers performed tasks whose importance was equally great but equally invisible. By the early morning light along a Qing dynasty canal, the water glimmers like molten silver. The laborers who dug and maintained it have already started their day. Some carry baskets of earth along the muddy banks. Others use long poles to probe the depth of the canal. The smell of wet soil mingles with the faint fragrance of nearby fields. At first glance, it may seem like an ordinary scene of labor. Yet this work is far from ordinary. It is the backbone of an empire. Feeding the northern cities. The canals were primarily designed to supply grain to northern cities like Beijing. Continue. Story 5. The fortress builders who shaped medieval Europe. Section 1. Stone, sweat, and silent labor. If you stand at the foot of a medieval castle in France or Germany today, you might be awed by its massive walls, towers, and gatehouses. Thick stone walls rise tens of meters above the ground. Arrow slits punctuate towers. Moats cut through the surrounding land, filled with water and crossed only by drawbridges. It is easy to imagine kings, knights, and battles defending these fortresses. Yet behind every stone in these formidable structures, there lies another story, one of thousands of workers whose names were never recorded. Stone masons, laborers, carpenters, and countless hands shaped these fortresses over decades, sometimes centuries. Their daily labor was repetitive, exhausting, and often dangerous. Without them, even the most famous castles would never have existed. The scale of construction. Constructing a fortress was not a simple task. A castle might occupy several hectares, with walls sometimes 2 meters thick and towers reaching heights of 20 meters or more. The stone for these walls had to be quarried, transported, and carefully shaped. Quarries could be located miles from the construction site. Workers used chisels, hammers, and wedges to cut massive blocks of limestone or granite. Transporting stone required sledges, oxen, ropes, and sheer human effort. Stones weighing hundreds of kilograms were moved inch by inch. Once on site, masons shaped each block, ensuring it fit precisely into the structure. Mistakes were costly. One misaligned stone could compromise the strength of a wall. The rhythm of work was slow, meticulous, and physically punishing. The workforce. The workforce at a construction site was diverse. Skilled masons and carpenters handled precision work. Unskilled laborers moved stones, carried mortar, and mixed cement. Haulers and transporters managed logistics, bringing wood, tools, and supplies from surrounding villages. Apprentices and young boys learned trades by assisting skilled workers. Labor was often seasonal. During planting and harvest times, villagers might be unavailable, so peak construction often occurred in spring and winter when farming demands were lower. Even so, laborers endured harsh conditions. Exposure to weather, risk of accidents, and long hours on scaffolding made the work perilous. Yet day after day, These workers built structures that could last for centuries. Mortar, tools, and techniques. Mortar was essential to binding stone together. Workers mixed lime with sand and water to create a paste that would harden over time. Scaffolding, simple wooden frameworks, allowed workers to reach higher walls. Ropes, pulleys, and hoists lifted stones into place. Masons shaped each block using chisels and mallets, ensuring a snug fit to distribute weight evenly. Even with these techniques, progress was slow. Some castles took decades to complete. Patience and repetition were central. Each layer of stone required care. Shortcuts could lead to collapse or structural weakness. Feeding the workforce. Thousands of workers on a large fortress project needed sustenance. Local villages often provided grain, meat, and other food, either as payment in kind or through taxes. Bakers, millers, and cooks were essential unseen participants in these projects. Without consistent food supplies, workers could not maintain the stamina required for the physically demanding work. In some cases, delays in provisioning led to interruptions in construction, demonstrating how interconnected labor with stone alone could not build a castle. The danger and skill of masonry. Working with stone was hazardous. Falling stones, collapsing scaffolds, and accidental slips could easily maim or kill laborers. Despite this, skilled masons developed techniques to minimize risks: careful alignment, stacking stones in staggered patterns, and using temporary supports during construction. Their knowledge was largely practical, passed down through apprenticeship rather than written manuals. Every tower and gatehouse depended on their judgment, skill, and careful repetition. Castles as labor chronicles. While castles are often remembered for the people who inhabited them, the labor tells its own story. Every stone bears witness to hundreds or thousands of workers, whose efforts were repetitive and invisible, but structurally indispensable. Long before sieges or battles, castles were shaped by sweat, coordination, and endurance. Historians often overlook this human story, focusing on rulers and generals. Yet without laborers, the political and military functions of castles would have been impossible. The temporal scale. Some castles were never finished in the traditional sense. Expansion and fortification often continued for decades. Walls were rebuilt, towers raised higher, and moats deepened. Generations of workers contributed to these changes. Children who assisted their fathers as apprentices eventually became masons themselves, continuing the work. The fortress, therefore, is not only a monument to medieval power, but also to continuous human effort, a centuries-long project of repetition and skill. A quiet reflection. Standing in the shadow of a medieval castle, one may be tempted to think only of the battles fought or the lords who ordered its construction. But pause and imagine the unseen laborers, carrying stones before dawn, mixing mortar in the summer heat, repairing scaffolding battered by wind. Without them, the fortress would not exist. Their repetitive physical labor created the foundation for the empire's military and political stability. History, at its core, is often written by those whose work is invisible, yet whose impact endures in stone, water, and infrastructure. A question to ponder. If castles required decades of careful, repetitive labor to shape stone and mortar, what other monumental projects across the world were built similarly? Who dug canals in the Americas, raised pyramids in Egypt, or carved roads across the Andes? And what does it tell us about human persistence, that empires and civilizations often rise not solely from leaders, but from the quiet, disciplined effort of countless ordinary people? The morning air is cold, damp with fog, as workers return to the construction site of a medieval fortress somewhere along the Rhine in Germany. The day begins not with a trumpet or a command from a lord, but with the quiet rhythm of labor. Shovels strike earth, Carts creak under the weight of stone, and masons tap chisel against granite to test its readiness. Unlike the lords and knights who live within the fortress walls, these workers operate in the shadows, their lives governed by the demand of stone, mortar, and time. Organizing the workforce. A large fortress project could require thousands of laborers, each assigned specific tasks. Quarry workers extracted stones from nearby hillsides. Haulers and oxen drivers transported massive blocks to the site. Masons and carpenters shaped stones and built scaffolding. Laborers mixed mortar, cleared debris, and dug foundations. The site was a complex network of activity, requiring constant supervision. Foremen ensured that stone blocks were precisely cut and delivered on schedule. One miscalculation could delay a wall for weeks or create instability that would threaten the safety of the entire structure. Foundations in mud and water. Castles rarely rose on perfect terrain. Builders often contended with marshes, riverbanks, and uneven ground. Before a wall could rise, workers dug deep trenches for foundations. These trenches were filled with compacted gravel, wooden beams, and stone to provide stability. In wet conditions, foundations became a dangerous and exhausting task. Workers waded through mud, sometimes knee-deep, as they positioned massive stones with precision. One misstep could result in sinking walls or uneven towers. Every foundation required careful judgment, repeated measurements, and endless patience. The seasonal nature of work. Construction was heavily influenced by the seasons. Winter brought frozen ground, making excavation difficult, but halted farming allowed more villagers to join the workforce. Summer heat sapped strength, and laborers relied on shade, water, and simple rations to survive the grueling days. Harvest periods often drew workers away from the site, delaying progress. Lords adjusted timelines accordingly, but such interruptions could extend construction for decades. Patience was a necessity not just for the laborers, but for the entire planning of the fortress. Dangerous heights and repetitive motion. As walls and towers grew taller, the risks increased. Scaffolds made of timber creaked under weight, ropes and pulleys bore enormous strain, and masons balanced on narrow planks while placing stones hundreds of meters above the ground. Repetitive motion lifting heavy stones, hammering and chiseling caused chronic injuries. Blisters, joint pain, and strained muscles were common. Despite this, the rhythm of work continued day after day. The fortress's survival depended on it, and workers understood that mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. Feeding the workforce. A workforce of hundreds or thousands required substantial logistical planning. Villagers and cooks prepared meals of bread, porridge, salted meat, and vegetables. Water needed to be carried from wells or nearby streams. Even these mundane tasks were essential. An exhausted worker could not lift stones safely, and malnourished laborers could slow progress or fall ill. In this way, the unseen network supporting the builder's food providers, porters, and water carriers was as vital as the masons themselves. Stones as communication. Every stone in a fortress conveyed more than structural integrity, it symbolized authority. Perfectly cut stones demonstrated skill and discipline, reflecting the lord's capacity to marshal resources and labor. Walls were not just barriers, they were statements. The laborers' repetitive efforts transformed raw material into instruments of power, silently broadcasting the strength of those in command. Their work communicated order, control, and permanence without uttering a single word. Coordination across generations. Many fortresses were constructed over decades. One generation of masons might lay foundations, while the next completed towers. Knowledge passed from foremen to apprentices ensured continuity. Even if political power shifted or lords changed, the work continued. Laborers, practical expertise, built on repeated cycles of measurement, cutting, and assembly, was indispensable. The endurance of these structures relied on human continuity, not merely design. Balancing labor and authority. Workers were often at the mercy of feudal authority. Lords dictated timelines, enforced discipline, and set quotas for daily output. Workers could face punishment for failing to meet expectations. Yet within these constraints, laborers exercised subtle autonomy, choosing the best angles for cutting stone, reinforcing weak sections, and advising foremen on efficient methods. Even in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, the practical knowledge of workers shaped the outcome of monumental projects. The fortress as a testament to labor. By the end of the day, dust settles on scaffolds, stones, and tools. Workers collapse into temporary shelters. The fortress rises incrementally, a silent monument to countless hours of repetitive, painstaking work. The lords may claim glory, chroniclers may write about sieges or politics, but the walls themselves tell a quieter story. A story of sweat, repetition, endurance, and skill. Without the laborers, there would be no fortress, only the vision of power left unrealized. A thought to carry forward. Castles, like empires, are often remembered for battles, sieges, and rulers. But consider the repetitive, invisible labor required to build them. What other structures across history, cathedrals, pyramids, aqueducts relied on similar networks of unrecognized, relentless effort? And if empires can rise and endure because of such work, what does that reveal about the true foundations of human history? By the early morning sun, the fortress stands partially complete. Towers cast long shadows across the muddy grounds. Scaffolding creaks under the weight of stones and workers. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of past labor, the tapping of chisels, the scrape of carts over cobblestones, the grunts and sighs of men carrying loads heavier than themselves. These sounds are long gone, but their impact endures. Every wall, every battlement, every arch tells the story of invisible hands. The human cost of construction. Life for fortress builders was grueling. In addition to long hours and dangerous work, workers faced harsh weather, poor nutrition, and the threat of disease. Illnesses could spread quickly in camps, and accidents on scaffolding often proved fatal. Yet despite these risks, laborers persisted. They returned day after day, sometimes for decades, to lay stones and mix mortar. Their survival and skill ensured that the fortress would endure beyond their lifetimes. Labor and power. Fortresses were more than military structures. They were symbols of authority and governance. The walls projected power, intimidation, and stability. Yet their very existence depended on laborers who had no political voice, no noble title, and rarely any recognition. This disconnect between visibility and influence is a recurring theme in history. Those who execute the work are often invisible, while those who command gain the glory. And yet, without the laborers, the visible power of the rulers would have been impossible. The art of repetition. The construction of a fortress relied on repetitive, precise labor. Chiseling stone into shape, mixing mortar in consistent proportions, and lifting heavy blocks into place day after day, these repetitive acts created both structural stability and a rhythm that sustained progress. It is easy to overlook such work because it is methodical rather than dramatic. But empires, like fortresses, are built as much on repetition as on vision. Feeding the soldiers of labor. Behind the fortress itself were networks of support. Cooks, bakers, carpenters, and water carriers ensured that laborers could continue working. These unseen contributors were part of a logistical system that allowed massive construction projects to succeed. Without adequate food, water, and materials, progress would halt, and the structure might collapse before completion. The fortress was as much a monument to coordination and endurance as it was to stone and mortar. Generational knowledge. Some fortresses took decades to complete. Families of masons might work across generations on the same structure. Knowledge was transmitted orally and practically. Apprentices observed and assisted masters, learning subtle techniques for cutting stone, stabilizing scaffolding, and mixing durable mortar. The continuity of this expertise ensured that construction could persist despite political upheavals, wars, or labor shortages. Castles in the landscape. Once completed, fortresses dominated the surrounding landscape. They served as military strongpoints, administrative centers, and refuges. Villagers, soldiers, and nobles relied on their protection. But the visible structure only hints at the countless hours of unseen labor it embodies. Each stone block, each arch, each gate is a monument not only to authority, but also to human endurance. The invisible backbone of history. History often celebrates rulers, generals, and battles. Yet the endurance of empires frequently rests on those whose names were never recorded. Laborers, builders, and artisans who performed repetitive, physically demanding work. Fortresses exemplify this truth. They were built through sweat, repetition, and silent coordination. They stand today as silent witnesses to labor that rarely appears in written records but shaped the course of history. Reflection on modern times. When you visit a medieval castle today, it is easy to marvel at its design or imagine the battles fought within its walls. But consider the quiet, invisible work that allowed it to exist. The masons shaping stone before sunrise, laborers hauling rocks through mud, carpenters building scaffolds. Their perseverance, repeated day after day, is as crucial to the castle's survival as the strategies of kings and generals. History is not only the story of the powerful, it is the story of the persistent, the patient, and the often forgotten hands that made power possible. A question to carry forward. If fortress builders in Europe shaped stone to secure empires, what other large-scale, repetitive human efforts quietly shaped civilizations elsewhere? Who built the aqueducts of Rome, the pyramids of Egypt, or the irrigation networks of South Asia? And what lessons can we draw about the importance of labor that is methodical, invisible, and yet foundational to history itself? Story 6. The Roman aqueduct builders who carried water across an empire. Imagine walking through the streets of Rome 2,000 years ago. The air smells faintly of dust and smoke. Children chase one another along narrow alleyways. Merchants shout prices for olives, bread, and wine. Above your head, arches stretch into the sky, their stonework so precise it seems almost magical. These are aqueducts, carrying water from distant mountains into the heart of the city. They supply fountains, baths, latrines, and private homes, transforming urban life in a way that few other infrastructure projects could. But the aqueducts themselves are not the work of emperors or senators. They are the result of thousands of laborers, stonemasons, engineers, surveyors, and unskilled workers whose repetitive, demanding work made the flow of water possible. The need for water. Rome, at its height, may have contained over 1 million inhabitants. Cities of this size cannot function without water. Drinking, bathing, cooking, sanitation all rely on a constant, reliable supply. Local wells and the Tiber River could not meet these needs alone. Rainwater was insufficient. The solution was to bring water from distant springs, rivers, and reservoirs through a network of aqueducts that sometimes stretched over 50 kilometers or more. Each aqueduct required precise gradients, strong arches, and careful construction to ensure that water flowed smoothly without stagnating or overflowing. Surveying and planning. Before a single stone was laid, Roman engineers surveyed the land. Using rudimentary tools like the corybates, a leveling instrument, and groma for straight lines. They plotted the path of the aqueduct with remarkable precision. The gradient had to be gentle enough that water flowed naturally, yet steep enough to maintain movement. Errors in calculation could cause water to pool or erode channels, threatening the entire system. The engineers relied heavily on experience, observation, and trial-and-error methods passed down over generations. Quarrying stone. Once the route was planned, workers began extracting the stone necessary for construction. Quarries could be located miles from the city. Workers used hammers, chisels, and wedges to cut limestone or tufa into blocks of precise size. Transporting these stones required sledges, carts, and oxen, often over uneven terrain. Even small imperfections could compromise an arch or channel. Every stone demanded careful attention and repeated labor, from quarry to final placement. Building the arches. Aqueducts often traveled over valleys or uneven terrain. The Romans solved this with the iconic arches we still recognize today. Workers built wooden scaffolding, then carefully stacked stones in a semicircular pattern. Each stone, called a voussoir, was shaped to fit perfectly with its neighbors. The final keystone locked the arch into place. Mistakes could lead to collapse. Precision and repetition were essential. Even centuries later, many of these arches remain standing, testifying to the skill of the laborers who built them. Concrete and mortar. Romans often used a form of hydraulic concrete to bind stones together. The mixture included lime, volcanic ash, and water, allowing it to harden even underwater. Workers mixed, poured, and compacted the mortar with careful attention to ratios. The process was repetitive but crucial. A poorly mixed batch could weaken the structure, potentially causing cracks or leaks. Every section of aqueduct depended on both skilled labor and repetitive diligence. Maintenance and labor. Building the aqueduct was only the beginning. Once water flowed, channels required constant maintenance. Sediment had to be cleared, cracks repaired, and vegetation trimmed to prevent blockages. Maintenance workers, often living near the aqueduct, inspected it daily. Their work was methodical, repetitive, and largely invisible. The city's water supply and its public health depended on this quiet, unglamorous labor. Feeding the workforce. Thousands of workers, including masons, engineers, laborers, and porters, required sustenance. Cooks prepared simple meals: bread, legumes, salted meat, and water. Coordination of food, tools, and materials was as critical as the construction itself. Without well-fed workers, progress slowed. Without coordinated logistics, the aqueduct could not be completed. The success of this massive infrastructure project relied on both human endurance and organizational skill. Connecting nature to civilization. Each aqueduct represents a monumental effort to bend the natural environment to human needs. Springs in the hills, rivers in the valleys, reservoirs in distant provinces, all were connected to the beating heart of Rome. Yet this feat was possible only through repetitive, methodical labor performed by people whose names are rarely recorded in history. Engineers designed the system, but the laborers made it real. A silent question. As water begins to flow through these arches, imagine the countless hands that made it possible. How did society organize such large-scale labor in a time without modern machinery? And if aqueducts require decades of repetitive, skilled work, what other monumental infrastructures, roads, bridges, walls across the Roman Empire depended on the invisible labor of ordinary people? The morning sun illuminates the aqueduct arches stretching across a Roman valley. The sound of water rushing through channels blends with the creak of scaffolding and the murmur of workers preparing for the day. For the laborers who constructed these aqueducts, each day was repetitive, exhausting, and physically demanding. Yet their work was the silent backbone of one of history's greatest empires, organizing thousands of workers. A major aqueduct project could require thousands of workers, including skilled masons to cut and shape stone precisely, engineers and surveyors to maintain proper gradient and alignment, laborers and porters to transport stone, mortar, and water, apprentices and assistants learning the craft through repetition. Supervision was critical. Foremen ensured stones were shaped correctly, arches were stable, and channels followed precise slopes. One misaligned stone or incorrect gradient could disrupt the water flow for miles. Working across varied terrain. The Romans often faced rugged landscapes. Aqueducts had to cross valleys, hills, and plains. Arches solved the problem of uneven ground, but constructing them demanded extraordinary skill. Wooden scaffolds had to support tons of stone, sometimes hundreds of meters above the valley floor. Workers repeated similar tasks day after day, placing stones, securing keystones, and reinforcing arches. Mistakes were costly, and the repetitive labor required both strength and precision. Tools, materials, and technique. Tools were simple but effective: chisels, hammers, mallets, and plumb lines. Mortar, often made with volcanic ash, allowed the concrete to set underwater, a critical feature for channels crossing rivers or marshy areas. Every step demanded repetition. Stones had to be cut precisely, mortar mixed consistently, and arches erected carefully. The labor was methodical, exhausting, and often dangerous, yet necessary for the integrity of the system. The role of water in daily life. Once operational, the aqueduct transformed Rome. Public fountains provided water for drinking and washing. Bathhouses became centers of social life, requiring a constant supply. Private homes connected to the system benefited from running water, a luxury unimaginable in most other cities of the era. All of this depended on the careful, repetitive labor of workers who shaped stone, mixed mortar, and aligned channels with meticulous precision. Logistics and supply. Feeding and supplying a large workforce was a challenge in itself. Villagers and cooks provided bread, legumes, and salted meat. Water had to be drawn from nearby wells. Tools and materials were transported over long distances. Coordination of food, labor, and materials was essential. Without it, construction could stall, and the water supply to Rome would be delayed. The project relied on not just physical labor, but organized, sustained effort across multiple layers of society. Maintenance, an ongoing task. Even after completion, aqueducts required constant upkeep. Sediment accumulated in channels, small cracks developed in stonework, vegetation threatened to block flow. Maintenance workers inspected and repaired aqueducts daily, ensuring water continued to reach the city reliably. Their work was repetitive and often invisible, yet it was essential for urban survival. A neglected aqueduct could lead to water shortages, disease, and social unrest. Skill passed through generations. Knowledge of aqueduct construction and maintenance was largely transmitted orally and through hands-on training. Apprentices learned from masters. Observing, assisting, and repeating tasks over years, they acquired expertise in stone cutting, mortar preparation, and gradient calculation. This generational transfer of knowledge ensured the durability of the aqueduct network across centuries, even as political leaders changed. The labor behind empire. Rome's grandeur is often measured in terms of emperors, senators, and military conquest. Yet the empire's survival and growth depended on repetitive, skilled labor, workers who built and maintained aqueducts, roads, and bridges. These men and women, largely invisible to history, sustained daily life and urban stability. Without them, the empire's iconic monuments and bustling cities could not have existed. A thought to carry forward. As you trace the path of a Roman aqueduct today, consider the human effort it represents. Thousands of hours of repetitive work quarrying stone, mixing mortar, constructing arches, and clearing sediment made the flow of water possible. History is often told through battles and politics, but the quiet, invisible labor of ordinary people shaped the empire in ways equally profound. Which other unseen labors in Rome, or in other ancient civilizations, quietly held empires together, ensuring survival, stability, and the flow of daily life for millions. The morning mist has lifted, revealing the arches of the aqueduct stretching across the countryside. Water glistens as it flows steadily toward the city, a tangible reminder of human ingenuity and endurance. For the thousands of workers who built and maintained these aqueducts, the task never truly ended. Their labor, repetitive, physically exhausting, and often overlooked, was the lifeblood of Rome. Daily labor and human endurance. Workers awoke before sunrise, carrying baskets of mortar or heavy stones to the construction site. Chisels rang against stone as masons shaped blocks with precision. Carpenters erected and repaired scaffolding, often hundreds of meters above the ground. Laborers transported materials over uneven terrain, sometimes wading through streams or mud. The work was relentless. Each day the same motions repeated: cut, lift, place, secure. Muscles ached, hands blistered, yet the flow of water depended on this routine. The laborers' contribution was invisible to the historians who recorded the empire's conquests, yet without them, Rome's urban life would have faltered. Arches and precision. Arches are the most iconic feature of aqueducts, spanning valleys and uneven terrain. Every voussoir, the wedge-shaped stone in an arch, had to be cut and placed precisely. The keystone locked the arch into stability. Mistakes were costly. A single poorly placed stone could compromise the structure and interrupt the water flow. Workers relied on repetition, skill, and careful observation. Centuries later, many arches still stand as testaments to their labor. Maintenance as a lifeline. Even after construction, aqueducts required constant attention. Sediment removal, clearing vegetation, and repairing cracks were daily tasks. Neglect could lead to water shortages, threatening the city's population, health, and morale. Maintenance crews, often underappreciated, ensured that the city continued to thrive. Their repetitive, meticulous labor was essential to the empire's survival. Logistics behind the labor. Feeding and organizing a workforce of thousands required careful planning. Cooks prepared simple meals, villagers provided supplies, and oxen hauled stones and timber. Even minor delays in provisioning could halt construction. Labor was deeply interconnected with logistical planning. The empire depended not just on human strength, but on coordinated effort across social and economic networks. Generational knowledge and apprenticeship. Knowledge was transmitted through hands-on training. Apprentices watched and assisted masters, learning to shape stone, mix mortar, and align channels accurately. Over years, they internalized repetitive techniques that ensured structural integrity. The survival of the aqueduct network depended on this continuous transmission of practical expertise across generations. Water as civilization. The aqueducts transformed Rome's urban life. Public baths, fountains, private homes, and latrines all relied on the continuous flow of water. This infrastructure allowed the city to sustain large populations, maintain public health, and flourish culturally and economically. Yet the marvels of civilization rested on repetitive, physically demanding labor work performed by individuals largely absent from historical narratives. The invisible backbone. History often celebrates emperors, generals, and monumental achievements. But the flow of water, the lifeblood of the city, was sustained by thousands of hands working daily, unseen and uncredited. Every arch, every channel, every carefully cut stone represents hours of repetitive, disciplined effort. The endurance, skill, and persistence of these workers enabled the Roman Empire to thrive, even as their names faded from memory. Reflection. As water continues to flow through aqueducts, imagine the quiet determination of laborers carrying stones, mixing mortar, and constructing arches. They endured hardship, monotony, and risk, yet their contribution was essential to the functioning of an empire. This reminds us that civilizations are often built not only by rulers and generals, but by ordinary people performing repetitive, invisible work that quietly sustains society. A question to carry forward. If Roman aqueducts depended on unseen labor for the survival of the city, what other vital infrastructures in history relied on similar hidden efforts? Who dug roads across continents, built granaries for empires, or maintained canals that carried food and resources? And in considering these laborers, what can we learn about the true foundations of human civilization, those built not in fame, but in repetition, endurance, and persistence? Story 7. The grain porters who sustained the Ottoman Empire. Imagine standing on the bustling docks of Istanbul in the late 16th century. The Bosphorus shimmers under the morning sun, reflecting masts and sails of cargo ships. The city, teeming with hundreds of thousands of people, depends on a constant supply of food. Grain, wheat, barley, and corn arrives from distant provinces. Without it, the capital would starve. Yet this supply is not delivered by officials or soldiers, but by thousands of ordinary men and women, the silent workforce known as the grain porters. They move, load, unload, and transport massive quantities of grain, often performing the same physically grueling tasks day after day. These porters, rarely recorded in official histories, were the lifeblood of the empire. Without them, armies would falter, markets would empty, and urban populations would go hungry. The scope of the operation. The Ottoman Empire spanned 3 continents at its height. Grain came from Egypt, Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Black Sea regions. Once harvested, it was bagged, packed onto ox-drawn carts and brought to rivers or ports. From there, it was loaded onto ships and transported across seas or rivers to Istanbul. At every stage, manual labor was essential. Large sacks of grain, sometimes weighing 50 kilograms or more, were carried by men along narrow streets, hoisted onto ships, or stacked in warehouses. The repetitive strain of lifting, balancing, and transporting heavy loads was immense, yet it ensured that the capital remained fed. Life of a grain porter. The work was exhausting. Porters started before sunrise and labored until late afternoon. Muscles ached from lifting and balancing sacks. Hands were blistered from rope and burlap. Feet were sore from walking long distances over uneven cobblestones. Meals were simple bread, cheese, and olives, but enough to sustain them for another day of work. Many laborers were seasonal workers, joining caravans during harvest or shipping season. Others were permanent employees of the state, responsible for moving grain year-round. Despite the hardship, their role was critical. Every sack transported, every barge loaded, was a step in keeping the empire alive. Organization and logistics. The Ottoman administration maintained strict oversight over grain transport. Porters were organized into guilds or state-supervised teams. Each team had supervisors, ensuring that sacks were counted, delivered, and stored properly. Warehouses were carefully managed to prevent spoilage. Mismanagement could result in rot, shortages, or riots. The labor was repetitive: lift, carry, stack, count, but the coordination ensured that the city received a steady flow of food. Even minor errors could ripple across the empire, affecting soldiers, markets, and citizens alike. Transport across land and water. Grain often traveled hundreds of kilometers before reaching Istanbul. Overland, porters used carts or carried sacks on their backs. Roads could be muddy, steep, or uneven. Along rivers or coasts, grain was loaded onto boats and ferries. Porters worked tirelessly to secure loads, balance weight, and prevent losses at every stage. This combination of land and water transport demanded skill, endurance, and constant attention. The repetitive labor of porters was essential for survival, not just convenience. Seasonal and political challenges. Harvests were not always reliable. Floods, droughts, or pest infestations could reduce supply. During times of political unrest or military campaigns, grain shipments were often redirected to feed armies. Porters had to adapt to sudden changes, carrying loads under pressure or across longer distances. Their work was never glamorous, but it directly affected the stability of the empire. A missed shipment could provoke unrest in the city, undermine authority, and threaten livelihoods. Porters as the empire's backbone. While historians often focus on sultans, viziers, and battles, the everyday operation of the empire depended on ordinary laborers like grain porters. Their repetitive, physically demanding work sustained cities, fed armies, and maintained social order. Without them, the grandeur of Istanbul and the stability of the Ottoman state might have collapsed. Every sack of grain tells a story of endurance, coordination, and unseen human effort. Reflection on invisible labor. Standing on the docks today, the noise of modern ships replaces the clatter of ancient porters, yet the principle remains the same. Cities rely on the quiet, repetitive labor of many to survive. Grain, water, and other essentials must reach people reliably. The hands that transport them rarely receive recognition, but their contribution is vital. History often overlooks these workers, yet their endurance shapes civilizations as profoundly as the decisions of rulers. A question to ponder. If the Ottoman Empire depended on porters to move grain across continents, how many other civilizations relied on similar networks of unseen labor? Who carried rice to Chinese capitals, grain to Rome, or supplies to medieval European fortresses? And what can the persistence of such labor teach us about the hidden forces that sustain empires throughout history? The morning fog lifts from the Bosphorus, revealing the docks bustling with activity. Grain sacks are stacked in precise rows, ready to be loaded onto barges or carried into the city's warehouses. The porters begin their day, muscles straining as they lift, balance, and carry. Their work is repetitive, exhausting, and monotonous but indispensable. While sultans and viziers are celebrated in history, the empire's survival depends on these countless hands moving tons of grain day after day. Organizing labor at scale. Large-scale grain operations required intricate organization. Porters were divided into teams, each responsible for specific sections of the port or warehouse. Supervisors recorded incoming and outgoing sacks to prevent loss or misallocation. Seasonal laborers were integrated with permanent workers to handle harvest surges. Coordination was essential. Without it, shipments could be delayed, warehouses could overflow, and the city could face shortages. Every repetitive lift, every sack carried along narrow streets or onto a boat, was part of a carefully orchestrated system supporting millions of people. The work itself. Porters faced grueling daily routines. Lifting sacks weighing 50 kilograms or more. Balancing loads while walking long distances over uneven terrain. Stacking and unstacking in warehouses or ships. Their hands were calloused, backs strained, and feet sore from constant exertion. Yet their labor was steady and precise. Mistakes could damage sacks, waste grain, or slow deliveries. Repetition ensured efficiency and reliability. Seasonal and political pressures. Grain transport was subject to natural and political constraints. Poor harvests demanded careful rationing and longer hauls from distant provinces. Military campaigns could redirect shipments to feed soldiers. Flooded rivers or rough seas complicated shipping, requiring porters to work under dangerous conditions. The repetitive labor of moving grain became a stabilizing force, absorbing shocks from nature and politics alike. Logistics and feeding the workforce. Supporting thousands of porters was itself a massive undertaking. Food, water, shelter, and equipment had to be supplied consistently. Cooks prepared meals of bread, cheese, and salted meat, while oxen, carts, and ropes facilitated transport. Any disruption in supply could halt operations, demonstrating how the survival of an empire depended not only on porters, physical labor, but also on complex logistical coordination. Repetition as skill and knowledge. Porters were not merely brute laborers. They developed techniques to optimize efficiency, balancing multiple sacks with minimal effort, coordinating with team members to move loads smoothly, using ramps, carts, and pulley systems where possible. This knowledge, honed through daily repetition, allowed the empire to move grain across vast distances reliably. Generations of porters inherited and refined these skills, maintaining continuity in food supply. Invisible yet indispensable. The Sultan may issue decrees, generals may march armies, and merchants may profit, but the empire's survival often relied on hands carrying grain through mud, sun, and rain. Porters rarely appear in chronicles or official records, yet their work sustained cities, armies, and society at large. They exemplify how repetitive, disciplined labor largely invisible to history forms the foundation upon which empires endure. Reflection on human persistence. Standing on the same docks today, you might see cargo ships instead of oxen-drawn carts, cranes instead of shoulder-borne loads. The principle, however, remains. Civilizations are sustained by persistent, often invisible labor. The Ottoman porters remind us that repetitive effort, when coordinated and sustained over time, can move mountains or, in this case, oceans of grain, keeping millions alive and empires stable. A question to carry forward. If the Ottoman Empire relied on the repetitive labor of porters to feed Istanbul, what other large-scale operations across history depended on similar unseen labor? Who transported rice to Chinese capitals, timber to medieval European cathedrals, or stone for pyramids? And what does it reveal about history when the survival of cities, armies, and empires depends on the daily repetition of invisible work? By dawn, the city of Istanbul stirs to life. Ships line the docks, their holds filled with grain from distant provinces. Porters shoulder heavy sacks, carry them up steep ramps, and stack them in towering warehouses. The rhythm is unbroken. Lift, walk, set down, repeat. It is monotonous, exhausting work, but it sustains the empire. The lifeblood of the city. Istanbul was the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. Its markets, mosques, and military garrisons all relied on a continuous influx of grain. Without porters ensuring this flow, the city would face shortages that could trigger riots, weaken authority, or threaten soldiers' rations. The labor of these men and women, repeated day after day, was essential to the survival of one of the world's largest cities. It is easy to overlook, yet the empire depended on it as much as on armies, taxes, and governance. Physical and repetitive labor. Porters faced long days of repetitive tasks, lifting heavy sacks multiple times per hour, traversing cobbled streets, or climbing ramps with precarious loads, stacking grain carefully to prevent spoilage or collapse. Muscles ached, hands blistered, and feet bore the punishment of hard labor. Yet the repetition instilled efficiency, rhythm, and reliability. Every sack delivered was a step toward sustaining urban life and imperial authority. The organization behind the labor. Coordination was essential. Supervisors tracked incoming and outgoing sacks, assigned porters to ships and warehouses, and ensured efficient workflow. Seasonal workers and permanent staff had to integrate seamlessly. Supplies of food, water, and tools had to arrive on time. This network of repetitive labor and logistics created a system capable of sustaining a massive city across continents and seas. The empire's power, in part, rested on the reliability of these systems. Hazards and endurance. The work was dangerous. Grain sacks could slip, crush fingers, or throw a porter off balance. Dockside hazards, wet planks, shifting cargo, and heavy ropes added to the risk. Yet laborers endured. Their repeated actions, often unseen by the city they fed, ensured continuity, stability, and survival. Through repetition, skill, and resilience, porters upheld the backbone of the Ottoman Empire. Invisible hands, enduring legacy. History celebrates sultans, generals, and victories. But the survival of Istanbul and the empire itself relied on porters whose names are unrecorded, whose efforts were repetitive and unseen. Every sack lifted, every barge loaded, every step walked carried civilization forward. The empire's continuity, stability, and prosperity depended on labor often absent from chronicles. Reflection on civilization. The repetitive, invisible work of porters reminds us that empires are not built solely on policy or conquest. They are sustained by ordinary people performing essential, repetitive labor that ensures food, water, and resources reach those who need them. Civilization's apparent grandeur is inseparable from the endurance, skill, and persistence of those whose work goes unnoticed. A question for the next story. If Istanbul's survival relied on thousands of porters, who were the unseen laborers that maintained other empires? Who built roads in China, canals in the Netherlands, or granaries in Mesopotamia? And how many civilizations depended more on repetitive human labor than on kings, armies, or laws, yet history remembers the rulers far more vividly than the workers? Story 8. The canal builders of the Netherlands who fought water and time. Picture the flat, watery landscape of the Netherlands in the 17th century. The air smells of wet earth, reeds, and the faint tang of brackish water. Windmills creak in the distance, turning steadily as they drain marshes and pump water from polders. In this landscape, canals are lifelines. They carry goods, drain excess water, and make agriculture possible in lands that would otherwise be submerged. But these canals did not appear magically. They were dug, dredged, and maintained by thousands of laborers whose sweat and endurance shaped the very map of the country. These canal builders, often overlooked in history, were the true architects of the Netherlands' survival and prosperity. Battling the water. Much of the Netherlands lies below sea level. Floods were a constant threat, capable of wiping out crops, homes, and livelihoods. The solution was canals, networks of drainage and transportation that required careful planning, precise gradients, and constant maintenance. Digging these canals was grueling. Workers wielded spades and shovels, cutting through clay, peat, and sand. Mud clung to boots and tools. Water seeped into trenches. Every day was a struggle against nature's persistence. Yet without these canals, villages would have been submerged, fields ruined, and trade hampered. The laborers' repetitive work directly protected lives and livelihoods. Organization of labor. Canal construction required coordination. Teams of diggers worked side by side, often in long trenches that could stretch for miles. Wheelbarrows, wooden carts, and boats moved excavated soil away from the canal. Surveyors measured gradients and depths, ensuring that water flowed smoothly and efficiently. Each laborer had a specific role and repetition was key. Dig, move, level, repeat. Mistakes could create blockages, overflow, or collapse. Life in the trenches. Workers faced harsh conditions. Muddy, waterlogged soil made movement exhausting. Cold winds and rain penetrated clothing. Long hours of bending, lifting, and shoveling caused fatigue and injury. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, and occasionally fish or vegetables. Temporary shelters protected against rain, but comfort was minimal. Despite these hardships, laborers returned day after day, year after year. Their endurance was vital to the survival of towns and fields across the region. Seasonal challenges. Work on canals was dictated by the seasons. Winter brought frozen ground that was difficult to dig, but it allowed workers to take advantage of downtime from farming. Spring floods could wash away progress, requiring repairs and repeated effort. Summer heat made labor exhausting, but timely work was necessary to prevent water from stagnating or overflowing. The repetition inherent in seasonal cycles ensured that canals were maintained and the land protected, year after year. Tools and techniques. Tools were simple but effective. Spades and shovels for digging and shaping the canal. Wooden carts and wheelbarrows to move excavated soil. Measuring rods and levels for gradients. Workers repeated the same actions thousands of times. Precision and consistency were essential. Even a slight miscalculation in slope could cause stagnation or flooding. This repetitive skill, honed over years, allowed the Dutch to turn marshy, flood-prone land into productive fields and thriving towns. Canals as lifelines. Canals served multiple purposes. Drainage to protect settlements from flooding. Transportation for goods like grain, timber, and peat. Water management to sustain agriculture and industry. Each canal reflected countless hours of repetitive, physical labor. The landscape itself became a testament to endurance and coordination. Without these workers, the Netherlands might never have thrived in such a challenging environment. Reflection on human persistence. Walking along a Dutch canal today, it is easy to admire the precision of the waterway, the orderly towpaths, and the still-standing locks. But beneath the calm surface lies centuries of repetitive, unseen labor. Men and women digging, hauling, leveling, and managing water. Their endurance shaped civilization in a land perpetually under threat from nature. The grandeur of Dutch canals is inseparable from the invisible, repeated labor of countless workers. A question to ponder. If the Netherlands survived and thrived because of canal builders, who else in history fought nature with repetitive labor? Who drained swamps, terraced mountains, or diverted rivers to make civilization possible? And how many landscapes across the world bear the quiet mark of endurance, skill, and repetition that history often forgets? Morning breaks over a flat, misty Dutch landscape. Canals glisten like silver ribbons, stretching toward villages, farms, and cities. For the laborers who dug and maintained these waterways, the day begins long before the sun rises. Their repetitive physical work, the digging, hauling, leveling, and dredging, sustains life in a land perpetually threatened by water. While engineers and city planners appear in records, the thousands of hands that shape the land remain largely invisible. Organizing large-scale labor. Canal projects often span miles of marsh, clay, and peat. Coordination was essential. Teams of diggers worked in long trenches, sometimes hundreds of meters at a stretch. Soil was removed with shovels, placed in wheelbarrows, and transported to nearby embankments. Surveyors monitored depth, slope, and flow, ensuring water moved as intended. Each worker repeated the same motions for hours: lift, dig, move, level, repeat. This repetition was not monotonous in vain, it was the rhythm that made the system functional and durable. physical challenges, and endurance. Working in waterlogged soil was exhausting and hazardous. Mud clung to boots and clothing, making movement slow and tiring. Trenches could collapse, drowning or injuring laborers. Repetitive bending, lifting, and hauling caused chronic fatigue and injury. Despite these hardships, laborers persisted. Each day of repetitive work contributed directly to the survival of towns, fields, and commerce. Seasonal cycles. The work followed natural rhythms. Winter froze the ground, complicating excavation, but freeing up labor from fields. Spring floods often erased progress, forcing workers to redo canals, a repetition that tested endurance and skill. Summer heat made digging exhausting, but timely effort prevented stagnation and flooding. The cycle of repetition and seasonal adaptation ensured the canals functioned year-round. Tools, technique, and knowledge. Simple tools supported complex tasks. Spades and shovels cut through soil and peat. Wooden wheelbarrows transported excavated material. Measuring rods and levels maintained precise slopes. Laborers repeated these actions thousands of times, honing both skill and efficiency. Even minor mistakes could cause water stagnation or flooding, so attention to detail was crucial. Canals as a lifeline. Canals served multiple, essential purposes: draining marshes and preventing floods, transporting goods such as grain, peat, and timber, regulating water for agriculture and industry. The laborers' repetitive work transformed hostile wetlands into productive land, supporting both economy and society. Invisible labor and its impact. The grandeur of Dutch canals is often attributed to engineers and planners. Yet their construction and maintenance relied on thousands of repetitive, largely invisible actions by laborers. Without them, cities could flood, trade could stagnate, and fields could be lost. Their persistence sustained civilization itself, shaping both geography and society. Reflection on endurance. Walking along a canal today, it is easy to admire its precision and order. But beneath the calm surface lies centuries of repetitive labor, endurance, and skill. Each trench dug, each wheelbarrow moved, each embankment built was an act of civilization against nature. The canals remind us that human persistence, repeated action, skill, and coordination is often the unseen foundation of thriving societies. A question to carry forward. If Dutch canals exist because of repeated labor against water, which other landscapes were shaped by similar invisible efforts? Who terraced mountains in Asia, dredged rivers in Egypt, or drained marshes in northern Europe? And what does it say about civilization when survival depends on countless repetitive actions rather than the grand decisions of rulers alone? The Dutch landscape glows under the afternoon sun, its canals reflecting the sky like polished glass. Bridges arch gracefully over waterways, windmills turn steadily, and fields thrive where once there were marshes. But beneath this serene scene lies the story of thousands of laborers whose repetitive, physically demanding work shaped the land over decades. They dug, hauled, leveled, and dredged tirelessly, often in dangerous, waterlogged conditions. Without them, the Netherlands as we know it would not exist. The daily struggle. The canal builders' lives were defined by repetition. Digging deep trenches with shovels and spades. Moving heavy soil to embankments using carts or wheelbarrows. Checking gradients with simple measuring tools to maintain proper flow. Each day, each action repeated countless times contributed to the larger system. Their physical endurance was matched by their precision. A miscalculated slope or uneven trench could compromise the canal for miles. These repetitive tasks, invisible to most contemporaries, were the foundation upon which Dutch civilization was built. Coordinated labor. Canal construction demanded strict coordination. Teams worked in long sequences along the waterways, with supervisors ensuring that soil was excavated, transported, and deposited efficiently. Surveyors continually monitored slopes and water flow. Temporary bridges and scaffolds were built and rebuilt, supporting the repetitive work of moving soil and stabilizing banks. This orchestration of repetitive labor allowed the canals to function reliably, protecting villages and fields and enabling commerce and agriculture to flourish. Overcoming natural challenges. Water was both the ally and enemy of Dutch laborers. Winter froze marshes, slowing excavation but allowing access to solid ground. Spring floods erased progress, forcing workers to repeat trenches and reinforce embankments. Summer heat sapped energy, requiring endurance to keep pace with seasonal demands. Through repetition and adaptation, laborers transformed a hostile, flood-prone landscape into productive farmland and a connected network of towns and trade routes. Canals as civilization. The canals served multiple purposes simultaneously. Drainage and flood control, protecting people, homes, and crops. Transportation, carrying grain, peat, and timber between towns and ports. Water management, supporting agriculture and sustaining industry. Each canal segment reflects the labor of thousands of individuals repeating the same actions day after day, year after year. Civilization depended not just on engineering plans, but on human persistence and coordinated effort. Invisible yet indispensable. History often remembers engineers, planners, or political leaders. Yet without laborers performing repetitive, often unseen work, the canals could not have been completed or maintained. They endured mud, water, and physical strain to secure survival and prosperity for communities. Each canal embodies their endurance, skill, and repeated effort, a silent testament to the backbone of Dutch society. Reflection on human persistence. As you walk along a Dutch canal today, it is easy to admire the orderly waterway, the sturdy embankments, and the calm flow. But pause to consider the hands that shape this landscape, the repetitive lifts of shovels, the long hours hauling soil, the careful leveling of trenches. Civilization is built not only on plans or leadership, but on countless repeated acts of labor by ordinary people, acts that endure quietly through time. A question for reflection. If the Netherlands, survival and prosperity relied on thousands of repetitive actions by laborers, which other landscapes or civilizations owe their existence to similar unseen efforts? Who terraced the rice paddies of Asia, drained swamps in Europe, or built irrigation networks in the Middle East? And what does it reveal about history when the survival and growth of societies depend more on repeated human labor than on the decisions of rulers or generals? Story 9. The salt miners of the Sahara who powered trade across the desert. Imagine standing on the edge of a vast desert, the sun blazing overhead, the wind whipping fine grains of sand into your face. In the distance, large white slabs gleam like ice against the ochre dunes. This is Sahara Desert, home to salt mines that have sustained trade across the continent for centuries. The salt itself, dense, valuable, and essential, is known as white gold. Caravans of camels transported across hundreds of kilometers to markets in West Africa, fueling commerce, economies, and the diets of countless people. But before the salt reaches bustling cities like Timbuktu or Gao, it must be extracted, cut, and loaded by men and women whose work is grueling, repetitive, and largely invisible to history. The extraction process. Salt in the Sahara occurs as hard slabs called salt blocks or salt cakes. Miners extract these slabs from ancient evaporated lake beds. Working in extreme heat, laborers use metal chisels and hammers to cut the salt into manageable blocks. Each block can weigh between 20 and 50 kilograms. The work is monotonous but dangerous. Sharp tools can cut hands and arms. The crystalline surface is abrasive, wearing away skin. Sun exposure and dehydration are constant threats. Yet the demand for salt, a critical preservative and nutrient, drives the miners to repeat this backbreaking work day after day. Organizing labor in the desert. Salt mining requires coordination. Teams work in shifts, rotating to prevent exhaustion. Leaders ensure blocks are of uniform size for easier transport. Laborers organize pile according to destination caravans. Every cut, every lift, every carried block is repetitive, yet each action is critical to the efficiency of the supply chain. A single misaligned block or uneven cut can slow transport or damage other blocks. Transporting the salt. Once mined, the salt is carried to caravan points, often hundreds of meters across shifting sand. Men and women load blocks onto camels or local carts. Camels are packed carefully. Uneven loads risk breaking the precious cargo. Miners may walk alongside for hours under scorching sun and dry winds. This is the first stage of a journey that can span weeks, connecting the mines to distant cities and markets. The repetitive labor here ensures that the desert trade continues reliably. Life of a salt miner. Daily life is harsh and repetitive. Miners rise before dawn to escape the worst heat. They work long hours chiseling, cutting and lifting blocks. Meals are simple, dried grains, dates, and water, often rationed. Nights are spent in makeshift camps, sometimes near the mine, sometimes along caravan routes. Despite danger and monotony, miners persist. Their repetitive labor is the invisible engine powering one of Africa's most vital trade networks. Economic and cultural significance. Salt was not just a commodity, it was essential for survival. It preserves food in tropical climates where spoilage is rapid. It provides essential minerals to prevent disease. It forms the basis of trade networks connecting desert and forest regions. The miners' repetitive work allowed cities like Timbuktu to flourish. Without their labor, long-distance trade and regional economies would collapse. Reflection on invisible labor. Standing on the salt flats, it is easy to marvel at the glittering slabs stretching into the horizon. But consider the human labor required to extract them. Repeated strikes of the chisel, lifting and transporting heavy blocks, enduring sun and wind day after day. History remembers the wealth of cities, the caravans, and the trade routes, but rarely the miners themselves, whose repeated effort was essential for survival and commerce. A question to ponder. If the Sahara's salt trade depended on repetitive labor under extreme conditions, what other critical commodities in history relied on similar invisible work? Who mined salt in Europe, copper in the Andes, or iron in Africa? And how did these repetitive labors shape civilizations far beyond the mine itself? And what can we learn about human endurance from people whose daily work sustained economies, nourished cities, and connected distant regions? The sun climbs higher over the Sahara, and the heat becomes almost unbearable. Dust swirls across white salt flats as miners continue their work, chisels in hand, moving block after block. For these laborers, the work is relentless and repetitive, striking, lifting, carrying, stacking. Yet each motion, repeated day after day, is essential to the survival of distant cities, caravans, and entire trade networks. Coordinating teams. Salt mining in the Sahara was rarely an individual endeavor. Laborers worked in teams, coordinating their actions to maximize efficiency. Supervisors ensured that blocks were cut to uniform sizes for ease of transport. Storage areas were organized meticulously so that caravans could load quickly and avoid loss. Repetition was the glue holding the system together. Every block moved, every chisel strike repeated across the day ensured that trade would continue smoothly. The harshness of daily work. Conditions were extreme. Temperatures often exceeded 40 degrees C, 104 degrees F. Sunlight reflected off the white salt, intensifying exposure. Wind carried abrasive grains of sand, cutting and scratching skin. Long hours of lifting heavy blocks caused exhaustion, blistering, and chronic strain. Despite these dangers, miners continued. Their repetitive labor ensured that the desert's harshness did not prevent the flow of trade. Transport to caravan routes. Once blocks were cut, they had to be moved to the edge of the desert, where camel caravans waited. Porters carried blocks on their backs or loaded them carefully onto camels. Routes were long and treacherous, with shifting sand, sudden storms, and extreme heat. Repetition was essential. Loading, balancing, and securing blocks correctly prevented damage during long journeys. The miners' careful, repeated effort enabled the caravans to reach cities far away, connecting remote deserts to bustling marketplaces. The caravans and extended labor. Caravans could include hundreds of camels and dozens of traders. Miners often accompanied caravans for initial transport to ensure blocks were properly loaded. Each day involved long hours of walking, balancing loads, and coordinating with animals. Even small mistakes could lead to crushed or broken blocks, disrupting trade and causing economic losses. The miners' repetitive labor extended beyond extraction. It followed the salt across deserts to markets, where it became essential for human survival. Economic importance. Salt was a critical resource, often as valuable as gold. It preserved food, enabling trade and survival in tropical climates. It provided essential minerals for nutrition. It underpinned regional economies, supporting merchants, cities, and states. The Sahara's mines were therefore hubs of civilization. Without the repetitive labor of miners, trade networks could collapse, economies would falter, and cities might starve. Skills passed through repetition. Salt mining and transport required knowledge passed through experience. Knowing how to cut blocks efficiently without wasting material. Learning how to carry heavy loads safely and balance them on camels. Timing work to avoid the hottest hours or seasonal storms. These skills were honed through repetition and observation, often passed down from older miners to apprentices, ensuring continuity in trade systems across generations. Reflection on invisible labor. The glittering salt slabs are a testament not just to natural resources, but to human endurance. Thousands of strikes of chisels, thousands of lifts and carries, countless hours under an unforgiving sun, these repetitive actions formed the foundation of a trade network that spanned the Sahara. History often remembers cities like Timbuktu or caravans crossing the desert, but rarely the laborers whose repetition made civilization possible. A question to ponder. If Sahara salt trade depended on relentless repetition in extreme conditions, what other critical goods in history relied on similar invisible labor? Who transported spices across Asia, gold across West Africa, or grains across Europe? And how did these repeated efforts sustain distant societies? And what does it reveal about human endurance when economies and civilizations rest on the repetitive work of people who rarely appear in written history? The sun is at its zenith over the Sahara, casting sharp shadows across the white salt flats. Miners wipe sweat from their brows, chisel in hand, continuing the relentless work that has fed cities, preserved food, and powered trade for centuries. This labor is grueling, repetitive, and often invisible, but without it, empires and marketplaces across West Africa would have faltered. The daily grind and repetition. Miners' days were defined by repetition. Chiseling slabs from the hardened salt crust. Lifting and carrying blocks weighing 20-50 kilograms. Organizing piles for efficient caravan transport. Each strike of the chisel, each lift, each carefully stacked block contributed to a system larger than any single person. Repetition created reliability, and reliability sustained trade networks across harsh deserts. Transport and caravan life. Once extracted, salt blocks entered the long journey to distant cities. Loaded onto camels, balanced carefully to prevent damage. Caravans traveled weeks, enduring heat, sandstorms, and exhaustion. Miners sometimes accompanied the caravans to ensure proper handling. The repeated labor of cutting, stacking, and transporting created a rhythm essential for the survival of both the trade and the populations depending on it. Invisible labor sustaining civilization. Salt was more than a commodity. It preserved food in climates where spoilage was rapid. It supplied essential minerals to prevent disease. It formed the backbone of regional trade networks linking desert and forest societies. Yet the hands that dug, lifted, and carried this white gold are largely absent from historical records. Their repetitive, invisible labor enabled cities, armies, and economies to thrive. Skills honed by repetition. Miners developed expertise through practice. Cutting salt efficiently without waste. Balancing loads on camels for long desert journeys. Timing work to avoid midday heat and seasonal storms. This knowledge, passed down through generations, ensured the continuity of trade. Repetition transformed mere survival into an enduring system connecting disparate regions of Africa. Reflection on human endurance. Standing on the salt flats, one can see only the glittering slabs and the vast horizon. But history is written in the repetitive labor of miners. Thousands of strikes, thousands of lifts, endless endurance under sun and sand. Civilizations often celebrate trade, wealth, and cities, but behind them lies the quiet persistence of laborers whose repeated work made survival and prosperity possible. A question for thought. If the Sahara's salt trade relied on repetitive, invisible labor, what other civilizations depended on similar unseen efforts? Who dug canals, terraced mountains, transported gold, or built roads across harsh terrain? And what does it reveal about history that the survival, wealth, and stability of societies rested on the repetitive work of ordinary people, often forgotten by chroniclers and historians? Story 10. The logging crews who built the Scandinavian longships. Imagine standing in the dense forests of Norway around the year 900 CE. Towering pines and oaks stretch into the sky, their trunks straight and strong, ideal for shipbuilding. In the distance, the rhythmic thud of axes echoes between the trees. Crews of loggers are at work, felling massive trees with hand axes and saws. Each strike, each cut is repetitive, exhausting, and essential. These forests will supply timber for longships, sleek vessels designed to navigate both open seas and narrow rivers. While sagas celebrate Vikings and their voyages, it is the labor of these logging crews that forms the backbone of exploration, trade, and conquest. Felling the trees. The process begins with selecting the right trees. Logs must be straight, strong, and free of knots. Teams work together to chop through thick trunks, using hand axes and wedges. Repetition defines the work. Swing, chop, wedge, repeat. Felling a single tree could take hours, even days depending on its size. The work is physically demanding, requiring endurance, precision, and coordination. Transporting timber. Once felled, logs must be moved from the forest to rivers or fjords for transport. Teams roll logs over greased paths, use sledges, or leverage ropes and levers. Heavy logs require coordination. Sometimes dozens of men work in unison. Repetition is crucial. Each log must be moved carefully to avoid damage or injury. The labor is monotonous, yet essential. Without properly transported timber, the longships could not be built. Preparing the wood. Before construction, logs are shaped and prepared. Stripped of bark, smoothed using adzes and hand tools. Cut into planks, ribs, and beams for the ship. Every motion is repeated countless times, producing uniform pieces that will fit together precisely in ship construction. Precision and patience are key. One poorly shaped plank could compromise the vessel's seaworthiness. Life of the logging crews. Daily life is demanding. Long hours under the sun or snow, depending on the season. Simple meals of bread, salted meat, and dairy. Harsh weather conditions, insects, and the constant risk of injury from falling trees or sharp tools. Despite the monotony and danger, crews continued day after day, season after season. Their labor, repeated across years, enabled the Vikings to dominate seas and rivers. Skill through repetition. Experience and repetition created expertise. Knowing the grain of the wood to avoid splitting. Timing cuts and wedges to control the tree's fall. Coordinating large teams to move massive logs efficiently. This knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, generation to generation, ensuring a steady supply of high-quality timber for longship construction. Timber as a backbone of civilization. Longships were central to Viking culture, trade, and warfare. They carried goods, raiding parties, and explorers across seas and rivers. Their construction depended entirely on repetitive, skilled labor in the forests. Without this labor, Viking expeditions and the influence of Scandinavia in Europe would have been impossible. Each ship embodies not just engineering skill, but the endurance and persistence of countless hands shaping wood day after day. Reflection on invisible labor. Standing on a fjord today, looking at a reconstructed longship, it is easy to admire its sleek lines and elegant design. Yet beneath the beauty lies the repetition of labor in the forest. Thousands of swings of axes, careful measurements, and coordinated hauling of massive logs. Civilization is often celebrated through its vessels, cities, and battles, but its survival and expansion often depend on invisible, repeated human effort. A question to ponder. If Scandinavian longships existed because of repetitive labor in forests, who else in history relied on invisible, grueling, repetitive work to shape the tools, vehicles, or infrastructure that enabled civilization? Who carved roads through mountains, built wagons for trade, or dug canals to move goods? And what does it reveal about history that the endurance and repetition of ordinary laborers often outweigh the fame of rulers or explorers? The forest is alive with the rhythmic sound of axes, adzes, and saws. Timber falls, rolls, and is hauled toward the fjords. The labor is monotonous, exhausting, and repetitive, but it is the lifeblood of Viking expansion. Without these crews, longships could not have been built, and the voyages that shaped medieval Europe would have been impossible. Coordinating the crews. Felling and transporting massive trees required careful coordination. Teams of men worked together, timing swings of axes and wedges to control the fall of each tree. Logs were rolled or dragged along paths, often using sledges or grease tracks to ease movement. Each crew member repeated the same tasks hundreds of times: cut, lift, push, pull, measure. Repetition was essential. It allowed massive amounts of timber to be moved efficiently, ensuring a constant supply of raw material for shipbuilding. The labor of transport. Moving timber from forest to fjord was perilous. Logs could crush hands or feet if mismanaged. Mud, snow, and uneven terrain slowed progress and increased exhaustion. Teams had to coordinate every movement to prevent accidents and damage. The repetition of rolling, lifting, and balancing logs honed both skill and endurance. This daily practice ensured that timber arrived ready for shipwrights to transform it into vessels capable of traversing oceans and rivers. Preparing timber for construction. Once delivered, timber required additional repetitive labor. Stripping bark, shaping planks, cutting ribs and beams. Testing wood for strength and resilience. Smoothing surfaces with adzes, chisels, and knives. Every step demanded precision and repetition. A single poorly shaped plank could compromise the ship's seaworthiness. Through repeated practice, workers developed the skill to produce high-quality timber consistently. The life of forest laborers. Daily life was grueling and monotonous. Long hours in harsh weather, cold winters, wet springs, hot summers. Meals were simple and functional: bread, salted meat, dairy, and occasionally fish. Injuries were common, from sharp tools, falling logs, or fatigue-induced mistakes. Yet crews persisted, day after day, because their labor underpinned an entire civilization's ability to travel, trade, and wage war across seas. Seasonal patterns and endurance. Work followed seasonal rhythms. Winter allowed access to frozen terrain, easing transport but increasing exposure to cold. Spring thaw required careful planning to avoid soft ground and flooding. Summer brought long, hot days ideal for cutting, but exhausting in the sun. The repetition inherent in seasonal work ensured that timber production continued reliably, supporting shipbuilding year after year. Ships as a product of repetition. Longships were marvels of naval engineering. Sleek, flexible, and fast, capable of navigating oceans and rivers alike. Depended entirely on high-quality timber prepared through repetitive labor. Each ship represented hundreds of days of collective effort, much of it invisible. Without the repeated actions of loggers, transporters, and preparers, these vessels could never have existed, nor could the voyages they enabled. Reflection on invisible labor. A longship gliding across a fjord is elegant, powerful, and iconic. Yet it embodies countless hours of repetitive, invisible labor, felling trees, hauling timber, shaping planks, and assembling parts. Civilization often celebrates explorers and raiders, but their vessels and their reach depended on the endurance and repetition of laborers working far from the spotlight. A question to carry forward. If Scandinavian longships existed because of repeated labor in forests, which other technologies and infrastructures in history relied on the same invisible repetition? Who built roads through mountains, carved canals, or transported heavy materials for monumental architecture? And what can it teach us about history when the repetition of ordinary laborers enabled exploration, trade, and conquest that rulers often take credit for? The fjord glistens in the morning light, and a longship lies ready at the dock. Its planks gleam, its ribs curve gracefully, and the hull promises speed and resilience. Yet behind this elegant vessel lies a story rarely told: thousands of hours of repetitive, physically demanding labor in forests far inland. The laborers, men and women wielding axes, saws, and adzes, have transformed towering trees into the backbone of Viking mobility, trade, and conquest. The culmination of repetition. Every longship embodies the repetition of labor. Trees were felled with precision, requiring countless swings of axes and chisels. Logs were transported over rugged terrain, rolled and lifted hundreds of times. Timber was stripped, shaped, and smoothed meticulously, each cut repeated until perfection was achieved. This labor, repetitive and monotonous, was essential. Without it, no ship could sail, no exploration could occur, and no trade network could expand across Europe. Coordinated labor across the process. Shipbuilding was the result of multiple teams working in concert. Forest laborers felled and transported timber. Carpenters and shipwrights assembled planks, beams, and ribs into seaworthy vessels. Craftsmen repeated precise measurements and shaping, ensuring each component fit perfectly. The repetition in each stage, from forest to fjord, ensured the reliability and durability of the ships. Seasonal and environmental challenges. Workers faced environmental challenges that demanded endurance and planning. Winter snow and ice made transport possible yet treacherous. Spring mud and flooding complicated hauling. Summer heat and long days facilitated felling but caused exhaustion. The laborers' repetition was also adaptive, aligning work patterns with seasonal conditions to maximize efficiency and minimize risk. Longships as instruments of civilization. Longships were not just tools of war, they were instruments of commerce, communication, and cultural exchange. They carried goods, people, and ideas across seas and rivers. Their existence depended entirely on labor performed far from the spotlight. Each voyage reflects not just navigation skill, but the countless repeated efforts of forest laborers who prepared the timber. Without this invisible foundation, Viking influence across Europe and the North Atlantic might have been far more limited. Reflection on human endurance. Watching a longship cut through a fjord's waters is inspiring, yet the true marvel lies in the labor that enabled it, repetitive, unglamorous, and often invisible. Civilization often remembers explorers, warriors, and rulers, but their reach and achievements rested on persistent, repetitive labor performed by ordinary people. Their endurance turned raw timber into vessels that shaped history. A question for thought. If Viking expansion depended on the repetition of countless forest laborers, which other societies relied on similar unseen work to achieve their greatest accomplishments? Who carried stone for pyramids, dug canals in Mesopotamia, or transported timber for great cathedrals? And what does it reveal about history when the endurance and repetition of ordinary workers formed the very foundation of exploration, trade, and conquest?